Díomh gach daoine agus fáilte go dtí a cuideamh brethebh is mise cuimhín ó Flanagan. Hello, everybody. You're very welcome to the Brehon Academy, and I'm Kevin Flanagan. And tonight I'm going to be joined by Bertie Brosnan, and we're going to be speaking all about Brian Boru. Bertie is a man who has put significant amount of time into researching the life and times of Brian Boru, and he's generously going to share that information with all of you and me in the next about 3 hours. So just brace yourselves for that. Before we get into that interview, though, please check out the website brehonacademy.org. That's where you're going to find my online courses. You're going to find plenty of blog articles, and we also have a merchandise store over there. So if you want to support me that way, I really appreciate if you could buy a mug or a t-shirt or something like that. If you want to support me on a monthly basis, then I'd ask you to consider becoming a member. We currently have 6 levels of membership, so just something for everybody, and you can become a member for as little as $1.99 per month. Um, oh yeah, check us out on social media as well. We have presence on Facebook, on X, on Instagram, and of course on YouTube. And if you're not subscribed to this channel, please hit subscribe now and like the video. And with all of that being said, let's jump into the conversation with Bertie Brosnan. So before we jump into the main interview, maybe you could introduce yourself for people who don't know you and talk a little bit about your background and how did you end up becoming so interested in Brian Boru.
Well, first of all, thanks so much, Kevin, for inviting me on. It's an honor. As we were kind of talking beforehand, I've been following you for quite, especially your course content and stuff like that, and on YouTube. So it's a real honor for me to be here. And expert. I would say I'm passionate, deeply passionate, and I'm a good researcher. And I love the story of Brian Boru. So I think coupled with what I've kind of learned in through the film industry, my skill sets and through social media content creation and also writing and stuff, I've just kind of delved into that world in a deep way for the last 10 years. So just a little bit about myself. I'm from Tralee, County Kerry, so Kerry man living in Dublin, and I have a background in filmmaking. I've made a couple of films in my time, narrative films, and I would have been an actor for quite a number of years, independent actor and commercials, some TV shows and stuff in Ireland, and so I did pursue a career in all of that, and so I have a background then in screenwriting as well. I've gotten grants from the council, arts council, and things, so I do have a background in writing and storytelling, and yeah, so that's kind of the bulk of the foundation of my experience. And then what actually happened was in 2022, because I kind of went through a lot of changes. We all know what happened in 2020, but even before that, I was kind of going through a transitionary period where like I wasn't really happy pursuing an indie film career, acting career. So then I was kind of into or in a kind of a transitionary mode for about 2 or 3 years really, and it kind of transpired into me starting to tell stories online about starting with Scotia's grave, because it's in my townland of Tralee. So I started with that on TikTok in 2022, and it just exploded. Like, I mean, 600,000 views, and I was just that was over time, but in the first say couple of days, 20,000, 40,000, 50,000 views, and I just started doing videos on Irish history, mythology, and folklore. Now, in saying all that, I had been researching the Brian Boru story since 2014. The Millennium really got me into it. The Millennium, the anniversary, sorry, not the anniversary, the Millennium celebrations for the Battle of Clontarf in 2014. And so while I was in the film industry, I was actually pursuing trying to get a Baru film made. And actually, if people are on my Instagram, Bertie Brosnan Films, you could see a recent enough post where I talk about this and this kind. And I know we can get into this, but it kind of detailed from 2015. It started with a 1 page pitch, and then it kind of developed over time into another script, another script, another script, and now it's a novella, like The Forgotten Prince, The Battle of Clontarf is available now. So that's kind of in a nutshell how I've got into it, you know. So as a just to say, yeah, definitely a good researcher, not an academic, but I have met some academics and I do research the academics and I do read a lot of books as well on the topic as well. So
Yeah.
hopefully that answers your question.
Were you at the event in Clontarf in 2014, the
Un-
Viking reenactment event?
Unfortunately, I wasn't. I wasn't. I was in Kerry at the time. And I was back in Kerry at the time after living in Dublin, and I wasn't there.
Mm,
It probably it probably was in the zeitgeist for a while around that time. There was a lot of talk around it, and also what kind of attracted me to. I wish I was there, Kevin. Honestly, it would have been amazing. Um, but another thing that kind of got to me, it was around the same time, or at least maybe a year afterwards, where the government of Ireland successfully took history off the mandatory subjects for junior such students. I think it was something like that, and there was a big outcry, even from some
yeah,
politicians, and I think they reversed this. So I started really getting, I panicked over that because I was like, what the hell is going on in our country? Like, we're not going to be teaching our kids, history, like, and then I kind of really started delving into it then, that was kind of a real impetus. That
yeah,
was actually probably the main impetus for it. That really got me into it, you know?
yeah.
Yeah.
And do you think you mentioned about when you posted about Scotia on TikTok
Mm.
and you were surprised by the amount of reviews that you had gotten? Do you think that that's an indicator of the times? I mean, do you think that Irish culture and history is becoming more popular now than it has been in the past?
Yes, I definitely think so. I definitely think especially then because it was all kind of new, this type of content was new enough, in terms of short form content.
Yeah.
And I think the platforms were ripe for the taking, kind of like with this type of content. Because honestly, I don't think there was many people doing it in that format at the time. And there's many people doing it now in short form content. No, there was others. No, I'm not saying I was like the first one or anything. It was not like that. It's just there wasn't many. There were definitely was people doing it. And I just think because there is a thirst for it because of, look, we won't get into huge politics or anything like that, but politically we all kind of know there's definitely things going on worldwide that
Hmm.
would lend towards a kind of a theory of like they don't necessarily, certain governments, certainly certain politicians in government don't want really to explore the real indigenous stories of certain cultures and things like
Yeah.
that, or at least they want to continue on with the very kind of superficial mainstream narratives of
Yes.
history. And people know this; they kind of innately know something's wrong,
Hmm. Hmm.
So maybe that's probably what
Yeah.
you're getting at.
I mean, you might not want to talk about politics, but I certainly can talk about politics in
You
saying
want?
that
Yeah.
I think, and I have good reason to believe that politicians, they're not very interested in us learning our history because our history is full of rebels and heroes. And I think that it wouldn't, it would behoove the politicians of the times of today to teach children about how to rebel against let's say
Mm,
tyrannical government, right? And we
mm.
can leave it at that and just move we can move on to the
Well,
next question.
just to kind of come in and before we move on, I definitely think there's something to that because I did make a kind of a personal video from after the first time I went to Bale Baruma, uh, but Brian Boru's fort, and it was a very personal kind of like I felt kind of inspired by the play. I had a kind of a spiritual experience there. For me, when I say talk about spiritual experience, I don't talk about it's not supernatural as it is supernatural, but it's not that I saw anything supernatural. I felt like
Mm,
a huge
yeah,
presence, like and I was there for a few hours, and I had a TikTok live stream and hundreds of people were on there and it's just this huge
yeah,
experience I had. I was inspired and I felt compelled to talk about how I did not learn about this in school, like in this way. I did not learn about Brian Boru's fort and the Dalcassians and the Dalcassian kings and these powerful kings and queens of the time, and I did not learn about it in in this way. What I felt I learned was a very stripped down version through the eyes of the conquerors, you know? And I know that's in hindsight now. Obviously, in hindsight, we can talk about that, but I definitely felt like it was like a generic version that I learned in school, and I think they want to keep it that way, you
Yeah.
know?
Hmm.
So
Okay, so let me start the interview then, even though we've been speaking for 10 minutes. I have a list of questions here that I'd like to get through through with you.
mm,
So let's start nice and simple and we can add layers of complexity as we go along. So for those who are listening who never heard of Brian Boru, why is Brian Boru considered such a significant figure in Irish history? Who was he, and why is he considered so significant?
Brian Boru was the ultimate High King of Ireland, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many, many scholars, many academics, and many people in general. They just kind of know this, right? And even in school, they probably would have said, like, you know, he was the High King, like, you know, that we all remember from the Battle of Clontarf. Obviously, there's a legendary story to Brian Boru, but there is an academic story to him as well. But essentially, he was the ultimate High King. What we mean by that is that he did actually rule Ireland, you know, and he did achieve that success that no other High King actually achieved. He also was Emperor of the Gael, and something that's written off as well by a lot of revisionists and things like that. And he was emperor like for around 9 years in Ireland.
Does that
Um,
include Scott? That I'm assuming that would include Scottish people, people in the Isle of Man. Maybe would it extend to Welsh and Cornwall as well?
I don't think it extends to the Welsh and Cornwall, even though maybe in their minds it did. But it definitely extended in that moment that they were saying of Scotland and of the Kingdom of the Isles for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think maybe the Dalriata maybe was probably the extent of it. That perhaps you could say that because you know maybe they because that was you know the foundation of the Gaelic world in Scotland. um, you know, maybe they did say maybe that was a very easy claim to make, you know what I mean? But the one thing that will lead it, we could talk about this afterwards, but the one thing that I really think that solidifies this is the fact that there was people of Mar, like there was a royalty of Mar that fought with Brian at Clontarf. So that was over on the east coast of Scotland. So you could actually say, actually, maybe it extended throughout the whole of Scotland, in fact. Now, they were making these claims like a lot of the time with high kings and things like that they made claims, you know, so they may have made this claim, but maybe the people in Scotland didn't really know about this. Now there are some theories to say that he was enacting tribute from certain parts of the west side of Britain, and perhaps also sending parties through Dublin, you know, through Sigtrygg and things like that to raid and skirmish and do all that kind of stuff on the west coast of Britain, and also maybe on the islands as well. So yeah, the people of Scotland, like for instance, there's one account I think actually in the account, the actual book that Brian would have saw himself that they actually wrote it into the Book of Armagh. It could be written down of the Scots or of the Scoti, Emperor Scotarum of the Scoti. So what that means essentially is Scots or
Yeah.
Irish.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's something that I like to talk about often on my channel is that, and Scottish people don't like this because they think that they're the original Scots, but there was a time in history when Irish people were also called Scots, and before the Kingdom of Dalriada existed, well, after the Kingdom of Dalriada existed, that part of the north of the island of Britain was known as Scotland, Scotia
Mm.
Minor,
Mm.
whereas the island of Ireland, what we now call Ireland, was called Scotia Major. And that's a little piece of history that when you say it to people, they're like, really? And I'm like, yes, we're not Gaels. Well, we are Gaels, but we're also Scots. That was the
Mm.
name of our ethnic group. So I believe that you're correct in what you're saying there, that Emperor of the Scoti or the Scots would mean all of the Scots, which includes people of Scotland as well.
Yeah. Yeah, like I mean, again, did he go over himself and like they had their own king at that time, you know what I mean? But like this was emperor, you know what I mean? So this is another status.
Yeah,
And you know, we can obviously get into this, but like um there was a new kind of there was a new system that they wanted to bring in. It was very clear that this was a new way of doing things. You know what I mean? And
yeah,
that's the great tragedy of Brian Boru as well, is that I believe it would have been a fantastic thing to continue on at least for a while, at least for another while, or at least, well, not at least for another while, maybe until fucking now. I don't know. Like, I mean, but it was the idea was to unify the land under this emperor. You know what I
yeah.
mean?
Hmm.
And you know, the likes of Charlemagne were to have done it in Europe, and like Charlemagne was emperor for 14 years. You
Hmm.
know,
Yeah,
and not that much longer. Like, and they were styling themselves after that. They were all very educated people. You know, they weren't just people that were through the eyes of our conquerors and through the eyes of the education system, and a lot of mainstream narratives will say we're a bunch of barbarians and we didn't know what we were doing, and we were constantly warring and we were constantly doing this and running around naked, you know, fighting in naked in battle and all this. It's all a load of nonsense, a lot of it anyway, you
yeah,
know. But just to go back a little bit about Brian Boru, Brian, just to kind of go back behind like all of this high status, he grew up in North Munster, in the area that we know now as Killaloe. At the time, it wasn't even called Thomond. It was probably it was most likely the Dalcash kingdom that he was going into, the territory of the Dalcash, a kin group, a clan, a tribe. I know there's disputes over what way to look at it. Kin group sounds nice to me. You know, it
yeah,
makes sense. It makes sense because it was about family. It was about who your grandfather was, who your father was. And he was born into a very specific location that became very apparent, very important for him in his campaigns and in his claim to the thrones that he got later on, which was right on the mouth of Lough Derg from the River Shannon, the actual highway of Ireland, the
yes,
first M1 of Ireland, you know, the first motorway of Ireland. And you know, this was very, very interesting where he was born, because I feel I'm doing something a bit unique. Maybe there are other people out there, but I am starting to kind of really examine his childhood and what was happening exactly when he was born, what was going on, to really go into the psychology of the man, because I do believe he was a product of his environment. Like
yeah,
every single thing that happened to him, I think kind of brought out of him the man he would become, you know? Because human psychology 1,000 years ago, not that much different to today, you
yeah.
know, except there
Hmm.
was different materials, different society, but the psychology was quite similar, you
There
know.
was less depression back then.
Yeah, yeah, there wasn't time to be
Yeah.
depressed. Yeah,
Okay,
there wasn't
so
time.
I can see that we're going to have a very in-depth conversation here.
Mm,
So let me revisit the childhood after I ask you to explain. His nickname is Baru or Baruma,
mm.
right? And I understand that that's not his original name. It was Brino Kinetic, I think, right?
Brian McKinetic.
Mac Kinetic. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
So where did the nickname Baru actually come from? And I know that it means tribute, and I know that the word bow is in it, and that's a cow.
Mm, mm.
So could you explain for the listeners, like, how did he get this nickname?
Yeah, so my understanding at the time when I was at Bale Baruma was that it's Baruma 100% of the cattle tribute, you know, because they were the Dalcassian you know, kings, and the families were cattle lords. But actually Sean Duffy, who I met twice now and who was a huge I would say um the main person I go to in terms of academics, like he's like the top for me, because he's just an amazing resource for all of this. And actually, I've delved deep into this before Philip's live stream on Irish medieval history, and that name probably existed before him, and it could actually be about the actual place he was born into. Versus, yes, it does derive from the cattle tribute, but actually the
Yes.
name Baruma was probably because of where he was from. Now there's other theories, and so yeah, so it was yes of the cattle tribute because they were cattle lords, but there's a poem that relates back to his uncle, and they were calling him of Baruma. So like,
Hmm.
it's likely that it was already existing in
Yeah.
this place.
I mean, when you consider that the word for road is boher, right?
Yeah.
And there's many like Boreen, Bohawk, Boinja. And I was actually just talking to a friend of mine at Ishnok on Saturday, and he was saying that Boinja is Bonya,
Mm,
and that's like the Boyne, right? The Boinja is the Boyne, but then Bonya is milk. And
mm,
so I would be open to the idea that this was a title that was connected to the land that he was born in, but that doesn't preclude it or exclude it from being also the reason why they had that name is because they were receiving a tribute of cattle. And
mm,
that was very common in those days, and it was a sign of nobility, let's say. The more people that you owed you tribute, the higher status you had.
mm,
And how did you get that tribute? Well, you had to lend, you had to give them stock, you had to um like what I like to say to people about this is that the word for noble in the Brehon law was flaith.
mm,
And then you have things like fear flahamon, which is the noble man's judgment, and banfla for a lady, right? But what's the Irish for generosity? It's flahuiliocht. So you weren't defined by how much you had. Your nobility wasn't the case by how much you had. It was how much you could afford to give away. And this was the
mm,
thing in Ireland, like there was nobody who was managing all the titles. It was you could earn your right to be noble by acquiring so much property and having vassals or having people who owed you tribute. The very nature of that, the very fact that you had established that kind of status, it spoke for itself.
mm,
Now, you couldn't do that in one generation. You'd have to sustain that wealth for three generations. But by the third generation of sustaining that wealth, your great grandchild or your grandchild would be able to claim, um, would be able to claim nobility just by the fact that they had all of this wealth and they sustained it for three generations.
mm,
So that's what makes our Irish system very different from like Indian system, right? Where it's very similar in many ways, but they have a caste system in India, which is like if you're born a farmer, you're going to die a farmer. But in Ireland, that wasn't really the case. And you mentioned that they were cow lords,
mm,
which that was. I'm picturing the pyramid here. You had like bonded free men, you had free men. And then you had Boara, which is a cow chief, and that was somebody who was able to lend out cattle to these Kayla, the free, what we call a free farmer or the free landtiller. Um, and that's how you established your status is by being able to lend your stock out to others, and that would make you flahuiliocht, generous.
mm. I love that. It's so interesting because I'm learning a lot now as well, and I remember doing one of your courses and learning about this as well. That idea of like being able to give away is the sign of wealth of your status and wealth. And actually, interestingly enough, when when you obtain the vassal, you probably know this already, but when you obtain the vassal, the thing that solidified it, say in the court in the assembly, was you giving them a gift. The king giving them a gift. Like you actually had to give them like a big gift. And that was the solidifying kind of moment that they
Yeah.
became your vassals. So that really
Yes.
emphasizes your point, like.
Well, just to add on to that point, the word for a pledge
Mm,
is something like yal, right?
mm,
And that's also the word for a hostage, gel. So you have Neil
mm,
ni Gialach. It's Nile of the nine hostages, right? Um, and I just learned a couple of weeks ago that the word for economy is something like Gaeligor, not Gaelgor, but Gaeligor. And so does that suggest that, the act of pledging, the act of giving a gift that was very valuable to you, and what could be more valuable than a hostage? what can be more valuable than giving like a relative over to the over king? Um, so yeah, I absolutely believe that this was integral to maintaining a strong economy, and as you said, it was a way of establishing agreement between a vassal and you as a king.
Yeah, and then to say about the hostages as well, because this is something I remember the first time I met Sean Duffy in 2018. I just couldn't. I was like, hostages, what the hell is this about? Like, because I was reading so much about, obtaining hostages. Like, this is a huge thing. Like it was all about like going into the other territory, and once you got the hostages, that kind of defined if it was successful or not. And even it goes as far as to say, like, you could con your success by taking hostages that were already kind of yours, or at least they're low level hostages from a kind of a kingdom that you kind of already semi-controlled, but just kind of, oh, look at me at my hostages. And then not only that, you had to bring those hostages back and put them up pretty well and look after them. And if you
Yeah,
didn't look after them, this was a huge problem, like, because they the hostages is such a weird scenario because we don't live like this at all. The hostages would be going like, but they would be looked after and in the halls feasting and
yes,
living quite well. No, they
yes,
couldn't leave, but there was stories then, legends and stories and folklore around, like, hostages like not wanting to leave in the end, you know,
yeah.
because they were treated better.
So yeah,
It's interesting, like, so it's
there's
all
a
about that generosity thing. It's all about what you're saying about this whole, how much can I give away to show how
yes,
powerful I am?
yes, and they were also very essential for peacekeeping. So
Mm,
the lowest grade of king was a Ritua. So he's the king of a Tua.
yeah.
And over that you had Rirurek. So he
Mm,
was like an over king.
mm,
And each of the Rituas, let's say there's five of them, right? They would give a hostage to the over king. And then if
mm,
there was a dispute between these different families in the different Tuatha, you would then go to the Overking and he would bring out the two hostages and they would be used to settle the dispute, right? Now, here's the thing. Uh, those hostages were given compensation for their trouble. It wasn't like they were just there, like they were actually given a portion of what the dispute was,
mm,
um, a quarter of a cow or something like that, like, and that's the other thing as well. We say cattle was currency, but it wasn't cattle as currency. Cattle was used to measure value. So
mm,
you could have a shade and you could have a shade of corn, but a shade is a milk cow.
mm,
Um, so yeah, it wasn't like they were being abused in that way. It was more that they were compensated for their hassle, for their trouble.
It's so interesting, yeah. And like, so at the time when Brian was born as well, like the Dalcash, as a family were vassals, like, so they weren't known to be anything other than that, and they would have come from the Deshi Tushkot, so the northern Deshi kind of tribe, and they were, it's even in the word Deshi to mean kind of vassal, is something along those lines, and so they weren't taken seriously on the grand scale, on the grand stage. And at the time when Brian was born, in Munster, the Oanachta were the primary kings. So they were vassals to the Oanachta, you know, and the Oanachta were vassals to the High King. You know what I mean? So that was the kind of system at
Yeah.
play for, during the time when Brian was born. Like, so
And who was the high?
he was a noble, but they
Yeah.
were vassals.
What family were the High Kings at this time?
So at that time was Donnacha Dunn. What he was he North? Was he Southern Neil? Of
So
course, there were the E Neils, but
yeah, the O'Neills. That's
Flan
the
Shinna's son. It's Flan Shinna's son. I'm pretty sure they were the Northern E Neils.
that's the I wanted you to say O'Neills, right?
Mm,
Because just to paint this idea of the political landscape at the
yeah,
time, um, because I know that the O'Neill clan were not very pleased with the rise of this upstart from the
yeah,
north of Dacia, from the Dalcassian, because they had basically had a monopoly on the kingship for
yeah.
between 500 and 1,000 years.
Mm,
That was uncontested. And it's interesting then when you read something like the Annals of Ulster about this account, they're not very pleased with Brian Boru because they
mm,
are more aligned to the O'Neills.
mm.
Um, um, yeah, so that's the answer I was looking for there. That like the High Kings at the time were actually the O'Neill clan, and they were basically they weren't really accepted by the Onochta or the Argilla, and that's another one actually. Argilla
Yeah, one of
is
the
the
kingdoms of the
is the
north. Yeah,
hostage exactly. So,
yeah,
um,
yeah,
so I wonder if you could just flesh that out a
yeah.
little bit and just
Well,
paint the picture.
I'll give you an interesting one that I've kind of, and I'm because I'm doing a series on Brian Boru at the moment, and it's all kind of based off my live stream with Phil, and so I have two episodes on my YouTube channel for anybody who wants to check them out, and I'm going to be continuing on. There's probably going to be about 10 episodes, but anyway, I'm theorizing, and my thesis on it is that actually the Eneals actually facilitated without them knowing Brian's rise. They sorry, the Dalcassian rise. And the reason I can say that is with confidence is because the year that Brian was born, 941 AD. Now, some people say he was born in the 920s. I think it's nonsense. I don't think that's true at all. And actually, most academics would agree. But you definitely see in some sources that he was born in 927 or something. I don't think that's true at all. But anyway, 941 AD, the same year, Donogh Dunn, who was High King of Ireland, he was actually married to Orla, Brian's older sister, believe it or not, the Dalcassian princess. Now, the reason they reckon that Donogh Dunn married her was only to do with creating division in Munster because he was having massive issues with the Munster High King, sorry, the Munster Over King or Provincial King, Calacan of Cashel, who was an Oanukta and obviously a great rival to the Dalcassian king of the time, Canatic, Brian's father. But the problem was that Orla got executed in the same year Brian was born, executed for a supposed infidelity on Donogh Dunn, and apparently she slept with her stepson, his son. Um, who knows? But to be honest with you, I think being executed for that is fairly harsh. And actually, to be honest with you, under Brehon law, I don't even know if that kind of thing is. I don't know. Like, was that a normal thing at that time to be executed for infidelity?
I don't
I don't.
think so.
I don't think
No.
so. I don't think so.
But the thing is, when you get down to it, it's like Brehon Law was more aspirational, but
Mm,
at the end of the day, it's whoever held the sword made
yeah.
the law. And that's
Yeah.
even the same today. Like the law is a monopoly of violence by the state. So,
It
but
is
anyway, I
very
don't want
true.
to distract
No,
your
but
flow of
it
thought.
just it seems a very that you don't really hear stories like that when I'm reading it. It just seems very severe, and I interpret it as having a huge impact on the Dalcash, because look, at the end of the day, they were humans, like and your daughter, your princess is it would have been a huge moment for the Dalcash. Oh, we're aligned with the High King. This is our big moment, like and maybe there was a big well, not maybe, there probably was an assembly and a marriage and the family probably were there when she got married, and now she's executed, and Brian was born that same year. So what you see happening after this is you start, because of that alignment, it didn't actually they were kind of elevated. Even though she did get executed, they did align with the High King. So this gave them a bit of a kind of a ground to kind of start looking at the Oanachtas of Cashel. And they did. So Kinetic started to, you know, battle with Calacan of Cashel, the Oanachtas. And in this time, in the preceding years, when Brian was young, very young, there was battles and there was losses, there was brothers being killed, and but eventually they started getting the upper hand. And Brian was sent off to Inishfallen to get his education, and we can get into all of that as well. But I wanted to just say that my theory is that without that marriage alliance, would the Dalcash feel that comfortable to start taking on Cashel? Who knows? Maybe they would, but it just seems like it happens after this, you
Yeah.
know?
Mm-hmm.
And, then what actually happens as well at the same time is that the Oanoctas start, it seems like they're not taking the Dal Cash very seriously. And neither was the High King because he executed their daughter and didn't really feel that bad about it. So nobody's kind of taking him seriously. So you start seeing, and it mimics in Brian's life and echoes in Brian's life, and also with his older brother, who actually is a huge influence on Brian later on. They start kind of taking these opportunities to strike, because with the obvious, aggression from the High King to Calacan of Cashel, this was kind of weakening them. So that's when the Dalcassians started striking. And eventually they would overturn the Oanoctas, that would be later on under Mahon, Brian's older brother. And this would actually, because this would create a kind of a new dawn in Munster, and then, of course, on the national stage,
Yeah.
Brian would take that to the national level. Um, you know,
How many older brothers did he have?
He was the youngest, so he actually had brothers that died before he was born, and he actually had around, I think it's around seven older brothers, and he
Right.
was so he was the youngest, and
Yeah.
every single one of them died except for Markin, an abbot who became an abbot.
Yeah.
By the time he was king of Munster, which was in 977, I think it is 77, 966, 976 or 977, 978, around that time, late 970s, all his brothers were dead except for Mark
Hmm.
and the abbot.
And the reason I'm asking you that is because Brian Boru, he was kind of a unlikely
Yeah,
Viking,
yeah, yeah,
because you would imagine that if the brothers were successful, if they hadn't been killed,
yeah.
then they might have become the High King in place of Brian Boru. So I wonder if it was destined to be, um, and what it might have been like if some of his brothers actually survived.
Yeah, 100%. And I think the nature as well of the how they died absolutely facilitated, and at least I believe changed his psychology, because later on, after he gets his education and he's brought back because all the brothers were dead, like, so and his father died as well around the time he was around 10 or 11. Kinetic died, and there was huge tragedy. He had to actually come back to the fort, like, and imagine him going off to Inishfallen. And I do believe that Inishfallen was semi-protected from major Viking influence because of where they were. I just don't know if there's huge evidence of huge Viking activity on Loch Lane and Killarney, Um, but imagine him coming back to the fort, like, and brothers that he would have played with before he left, all dead, like. So him and Mahon were left with Markin, and he would have started kind of being the understudy to Mahon. So it was only him and Mahon left,
Yeah.
So it went from him being the youngest son to him being the next in line, because Markin was already in the religious world,
Yes.
and Markin was older as well. So yeah, like, and then when his brother got tragically slain, tragically deceived, or tragically killed and deceived by a contingency of Malloy of Desmond, of Donnaquin of around the kind of Limerick, maybe North Kerry area, and Ivar of Limerick. There was they wanted peace with
Hmm.
Mahon, because there was this big thing happening in Munster as well, that obviously the Oanoctas were losing power. As I was saying, that this whole thing was being challenged now for around a decade or so. So there was this kind of weird thing with the records where they're not quite sure who was king of Munster, because there
Okay.
was because Mahon had been challenging so much and actually having huge success, that it's almost like what was happening on the national stage when Brian was coming to fruition, where certain annals and things like that were just kind of leaving it out. So some people say Mahon took over the 960s. Some people say it was later on, but essentially what was actually happening is a power shift was happening, and Mahon was becoming the most powerful king in Munster, whether they liked it or not.
Hmm.
So the only way to get rid of this was to deceive him and bring him into peace talks, so-called peace talks, exactly like, say, the beginning of Braveheart. You know what I mean? When the father
Okay.
goes off, you know what I mean? Something along
Yes.
those
Yes.
lines. And they lit they they killed him,
Yeah.
Brian at this time was a commander under Mahon, and he would have won a battle with Mahon. This at this time as well, they had already defeated the Limerick Vikings, but they weren't completely annihilated, but they had been defeated in a very important battle, the Battle of Solcoit. And Brian was a commander by this point. Like, he had
Yeah.
learned a lot from his education in Ishvalin and also as well under Mahoon or Mahon. And when Mahon was tragically killed, and I know we're kind of skipping ahead a bit because we could be there all day, like, because I have to
Yeah.
go through the timeline a little bit fast. Just giving you the indicators as to why he rose so well, and also to on my point of him striking when there was opportunities.
Yes.
When Mahon was killed tragically and deceived with being deceived, Brian went on something which I believe would make one of the greatest TV series seasons of a TV series of all time. Honestly, he went on a literal crusade in one about 12 to 18 months. He went from Limerick and literally slaughtered Ivar of Limerick and his sons on Scattery Island after incorporating Limerick City.
Yeah.
He didn't actually claim to be
So
king of.
just a
Yeah,
point of clarification,
yeah,
when you say Ivor, you're talking about the Vikings, right?
yeah. Apologies. Yes, I know I'm
Yeah.
skipping it a little bit.
No, no, no. I
Ivar.
just I'll because we've spent a lot of time talking about Irish clans, right? But we
Mm,
haven't spent a lot of time talking about the Vikings. And I believe
mm,
the Vikings landed in the late 700s or something like that.
yeah,
And you're talking about this is now 970-ish, right?
yeah, yeah,
So that's 200 years
yeah,
of Vikings being in Ireland. So
yeah.
could you maybe like start to introduce the Viking clans and
Absolutely.
how was Viking Ireland at this time?
Absolutely. Yes, yes. Because the timeline is so dense, you know what I mean? It's easy to kind of skip over things. So thanks for pointing that out. 100%. Limerick, was the closest settlement to the Dalcassian kingdom. So a stone throws on the River Shannon. I reckon they're up there in I don't know how many hours, but it could be very quick. They're so close because it's on the River Shannon. So the Norse city state of Limnoch was very much a powerful Norse entity at that time. Now, the Vikings were in Ireland for, as you said, for around 200 years, really about 120, 150 years in terms of them settled into Ireland. But this actual King of Limerick was a Norse Viking. He wasn't Hiberno Norse. He was a Norse. He was a Norse Viking, Ivar of the Emar dynasty. I'm reading a book at the moment by Claire Downham. Actually, it's amazing. It's over there somewhere. She's talking about the Viking world. So these were the last. So there was a massive amount of Hiberno Norse, which is Irish Vikings, right? That were living in these city states. Limnock was the closest one. Limerick to the Dalcassian kingdom. Cork, Waterford, Dublin, and then little settlements, these little towns as well, like Arklow and Dundalk and places like that, right? But the main capitals of the Norse world in Ireland were those cities. So these were important trading ports for the Irish. So what actually happened with the Vikings? They started raiding and they were a menace in the beginning, especially for the first 50 years, and they were a disaster. The actual heathen Vikings that we kind of like to kind of simplify everything, they were that in the beginning. But they actually did begin to work with the Irish quite early on. And because the thing is, the one thing this Viking series gets right, even though so much of it is wrong, is they do actually talk about the fact that they weren't just trying to raid, they were trying to find new lands to settle on because they were having huge issues in Scandinavia for various reasons for another day. So when they came to Ireland, they were interested in getting involved. And actually, the Irish were very much interested in getting them involved, you know, because they did.
Yes.
They got
Yes.
involved with the Irish kings, and the Irish kings were incorporating them into like their plans and their tactics and stuff. Now, yes, there was loads of battles, and there was many times they were vanquished and they were put down when they were trying to conquer areas and things like that. But actually, they became a part of the political and social cultural scene. No doubt about it. And by this point, they were very much entrenched in the political scene. But the problem with, say, let's say this guy Ivar, he was a huge menace because he, especially in the Cogad Gael Gálach, the propaganda piece that was written a couple of maybe 150 years after Brian's death.
And just for the listeners, that means the battle between the Gaels and the foreigners, right?
Exactly, the war with the Irish and the foreigners. Yeah, they would have put him as like the top enemy of Munster. But I definitely think there's some truth in it. Now, obviously, this whole huge kind of romanticized kind of fantasy version of it is obviously, a little bit ridiculous. But let's get the kernels of truth from it. That no, this guy was a Norse Viking. He was involved in the treacherous the killing of Mahoon. They did have battles with them. He wasn't some guy that was just hanging out like, he wanted power. They wanted to control the foreigners of the area. So there is this kind of self-styled label that has survived that he called himself King of the Foreigners in Ireland. You know what I mean? So they were very much trying to battle with the other Vikings, battle with the Irish. They were trying to dominate the Vikings of Ireland themselves. So there was that whole thing as well where that the first kind of Viking age was the Norse, then the second Viking were the Danes, and a lot of the second Viking age that happened, there is a lot of academic work done that the Danes were coming over to subjugate the Norse, you know? So they weren't just coming here to attack and dominate, but they were here to actually subjugate the Norse because of their own conflicts between Denmark and Norway. So
That's
this is the
interesting. Yeah.
complexity of it, man. It's so complex, like, and that's why it's hard to, unless you do huge copious amounts of research, it's hard to decipher it. Like, and you do kind of have to come up with your own theses based on your own research. Like, and for me, what I believe to be true is that Ivar was trying to dominate the area. And that's why Brian went straight to Limerick right after this death. He didn't mess, he just went straight there, took Limerick, incorporated it. They retreated onto Scattery Island. This is how much Brian wanted to fix this issue. He actually did something that was probably something that he confessed to a priest or that he probably carried with him for his whole life. He went into a monastery and slaughtered them because they retreated into the monastery. Ivar of Limerick. Just to remind everybody, Ivar of Limerick was the king of Limerick, and he had battled with Brian, lost to Brian and Mahoon's army, and was involved in Mahon's death, and was a self-styled king of the foreigners. They retreated into the Scattery Island. It's an island in the estuary of the River Shannon, and Inish Stibden, I think it's called, is one, or Inish Cottig, it's one or the other. Maybe it's not Inish Cottig. Anyway, they retreated into the monastery thinking they would be safe. And they should have been probably, but Brian,
Were the Vikings Christians at this stage?
I don't think Ivar was a real Christian. I think maybe they kind of flirted with it and kind of maybe presented it a little bit, but I
Mm.
don't think I don't think they were full. I don't think he was a full Christian. Yes, Highburner Norse had, there potentially probably was certain things that happened, like ceremonies, baptisms, and things like that. But were they really full Christianized Vikings? For me, I'm not too sure. It's
Yeah.
hard to answer. Like, I mean, this guy was a Norse Viking. It's up to people to decide that for themselves. For me, I don't think he was a full Christian. That's just the way I look at
What do
it.
you mean when you say full Christian?
I do believe that they had pagan, still were holding on to pagan ways,
Okay.
heathen ways. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. Now, so when I say that, feel like they were still he was still very culturally Norse, like, and I
Hmm.
think
Yeah.
it was politically Christian, maybe, you know.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, Brian went in and he slaughtered them. A great crime to the
I
ecclesiastical.
mean, yeah. I mean, everybody knows. I mean, that monasteries are supposed to be sanctuary.
Yeah, yeah. So it just proves that this is how much this was a huge problem for Brian. What happened? This shows that this he wasn't messing around. Like sometimes a great crime can lead to great success. There's a mafia saying that says that as well. And actually, Philip of Irish Medieval History, who you did a video with recently, which was a fantastic watch actually, would have said like they're kind of like a bunch of cartels when you really look at the the Tuas and the more
I
Tuas and
mean, that's a
you
good
know,
point, and I had
yeah,
never thought of it that way before because they were all families,
yeah,
and it's
yeah,
like for the family,
yeah, 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 yeah.
Respect me, respect the
Yeah,
family.
the kin group, like, you know.
Yeah,
Then just to quickly kind of just to move ahead real quick because we can keep moving then, is that right after this two battles with the two other lads that were involved in the killing of Mahon, the two Oanach kings that were left, and he just walked right through them. Then he became King of Munster. Not only till then, so this was the difference between him and I'd say a lot of other kings, because I've noticed this with the kings, that you research and stuff like that, even when he was in his prime, or sorry, in his high status level, he did things kind of formally and also bar going into the monastery, but he didn't claim to be king of Munster until he got rid of these guys and actually went and subjugated the whole province. Then he was king of Munster.
I
And then
see.
to kind of just very quickly say the Waterford Vikings, then another Ivar of Waterford, who were Hiberno Norse at this point, Hiberno Norse, it seems like they became great buddies. I mean, they just became unbelievable buddies because that fleet of Viking ships entered Brian's fleet immediately.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
so that was something that I was really I was surprised to learn many years ago now, but at the time I assumed that when Brian Boru was the High King and he united all the clans, I assumed that they were all Irish clans.
mm,
And I assumed that he was fighting all Viking clans. But
mm,
it turns out, and maybe we can get into this in a little while, but it turns out that things were a little bit more complicated than that first appearance.
yeah.
So before we get to that though, how did he become High King? After describing how he became King of Munster, what steps happened next in order for him to become High King?
Yeah, so obviously it's a long enough process, but like just to really just highlight the years. So around the time he became King of Munster, what's very interesting is that he after this crusade he kind of stops. Nothing as much is said about him for a few couple of years, maybe a couple, maybe 2 or 3 years. I believe what was happening was recovery, refortification, building, planning, getting everything up and running. And this is why this whole concept of warring all the time, it's a load of nonsense. Like it just couldn't be more further from the truth. There were seasons for warring. But the thing is, people get mixed up. They kind of think, oh, they were constantly warring. No, they were constantly trying to expand their territories, their skirmishes, cattle raiding, and things like that. If that's warring to people, then they have no idea how the medieval world worked. The actual amount of pitched battles that Brian actually had is not that many, you know. So in these preceding years, what actually began to happen then is because, as you said earlier on, this upstart from Munster, he definitely was known now. Like, I mean, this guy, it was known now. Like, so, especially when he did start to kind of, moving into other territories, the first one being Ossory. And he did, and again, Brian wasn't successful in the beginning. He had one campaign, wasn't successful, came back, was successful. It took time. What you start to see, and Sean Duffy's work is amazing. I look up there because his book is up there. He's got a map of all the campaigns, and all you just see is there are these arrows, and all the different color coding, and then the literal arrows are just going around. You could just see they're building and building and building to go up or just all around Ireland. It's unbelievable when you look at it. And then naval campaigns started getting incorporated and stuff up through the Shannon. The Shannon was absolutely essential for him. Máel Sechnaill, who became High King, I think after Donogh had done, was going to be the next, nemesis, And so Máel Sechnaill, I believe, did something very silly when he found out about this upstart and wasn't happy with Brian coming up the River Shannon and hearing about Ossory, little bits of things with Leinster. He went down, and I've been to this site, the My R site. I find it very hard to pronounce the name because I've mixed it up so much. I think it's the My R. I think it is. It's in County Clare, the Tulla Quinn region. It's the Dalcassian crowning point, and you probably know a lot about this, where they had the sacred trees to formally inaugurate the kings, and this was their sacred site where they used to call it the Bille. So they used to take a little branch off the tree, and this was a part of the formal ritual when the king would become king of the Dalcash. So Brian would have become king of Dalcash here. So Máel Sechnaill came down and he cut down this tree in the 980s, and that didn't seem to bother. It probably bothered him, but it just didn't seem to knock Brian off his track at all. And I think this is why Máel Sechnaill was unsuccessful in the end, because I just felt it was a petty kind of a move and not really showing huge strength. And he was meant to be High King at the time. And the difference between him and Brian was that Brian was going up with fleets and he was going up into areas and walking onto territory and just saying, I'm here, like, So it just started becoming this whole movement up into Connacht and into Leinster and getting, attempting to get hostages, failing, coming back, getting hostages, incorporating Waterford. Obviously, Limerick was incorporated, and then just moving up into Máel Sechnaill's territory. He was the Southern Neil, so his whole kingdom was the kingdom of Mead. Mead, so it was right in the center of Ireland, the royal capital of Ireland.
Hmm.
So he was going right by Máel Sechnaill's territory on the boat. Like, imagine 300 ships, and this is written into the annals of Ireland. 300 ships coming up the River Shannon. Imagine how that would look. Imagine that on a TV series.
Yeah,
300 ships, and you have this new king of Munster coming up the Shannon, like right through your territory. And what can you do about that? Nothing.
yeah,
So it was real
it-
symbolic. So what you
yeah.
start to notice is
It
a
was like it
symbol.
was like he was showing his strength.
Sure, it's true might.
Yeah,
He did things in a kind of a dictator, and I know dictator has a horrible connotations, which it is a horrible kind of a thing in the modern world, but in these times, this is kind of essentially what they were,
yes,
and well, definitely him anyway. He just said like,
yeah.
it was just like,
You just reminded me of a question that I was asked by Phil O'Heda from Irish Medieval History, and he was like, "Did they even need a king?" He asked me, "Did the Irish even need a king at the time?" And I was like, "Yeah, because they needed a dictator. They needed
mm,
somebody who was," and who was talking about Brian Boru,
mm,
in the context of Brian Boru, and I was like, I said they had a king. Whether they needed one or not is not really the point. And I said there's times in history where you do need a dictator. And I a good student of history, so I know that in ancient Rome, the dictator was very important role because it's only when they were being invaded this dictator title was given to somebody in the government, in the Senate, let's say, and they were the ones because the way the Roman Republic was set up, you had two proconsuls,
mm.
and they couldn't do anything unless they both agreed. But the dictator was superseded that because it was like one voice. It was to speak. It literally just means to speak, the speaker.
Yeah, dictator,
Um,
dictation. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, exactly. And so I have a bit more of a let's say a bit more mature view because I know when people say dictator, they think of people like Hitler or Mussolini and
Yeah.
Stalin. Um,
It's a huge problem in the modern world is that we always, and this, I did a video on this, the why Clontarf still matters, and I talk about this where there's people just trying to rewrite history and people through modern lenses and obviously and through lenses that I think are absolutely abhorrent, like and they're going back and they're rewriting stuff, and it's just like, how can you talk about something from a modern lens, which is 1,000 years ago? It makes absolutely no sense, even to go back 50 years and talk about things like that. It doesn't make any sense because
no, it doesn't.
it doesn't. It makes no sense. Like even to talk about myself 10 years ago from a mature perspective, I can give myself a hard time for things I've done 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and of course, but like I was young and I was, whatever, like, I'm
Yeah.
just saying as an example,
We were talking about hostages earlier, and the
Mm.
other thing, the other uncomfortable truth about early Ireland is that they also had slaves.
Yeah, yeah, they did.
And I
Yeah,
often say, because you get a lot of pushback from that when you're speaking publicly, when I'm speaking publicly, and I often say it's not appropriate to judge even though it's tempting, it's not appropriate to judge the past through a modern lens.
yeah,
And I said, if you weren't a slave, you were probably going to die because slavery was like the next best thing to being out on your own. And if you're out on your own, if you're considered like an outlaw, you were allowed to be treated like an animal because you're not going to be protected. You're not going to have the protection of the
yeah.
law. So I would say this, and I do say this, um, if you're paying tax today,
Yeah.
any tax, are you not a slave?
I was just gonna say we're fucking slaves nowadays,
Exactly. And the only
Yeah.
thing worse than you not recognizing the hierarchy is pretending that it doesn't exist.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, 100%. And that's it. Like the whole system was in place. They didn't quite like, well, obviously maybe there was questions, but it's not like they were just standing around saying, "Oh my God, this system is absolutely horrendous and we need to fix this system. We need to do this. We need to do that." It's just the way things were.
There
It's
was
like the
no
way.
such thing as human rights back then, you know?
Yeah, like imagine from 100 years from now, we're probably going to be looking at things we're doing now and saying, "What the hell were they at?" Like, I mean, that's crazy. Why would you do that? You know? So
Yeah.
yeah, so to go back to Brian, like it was a kind of a show. What I love about the story as well is the way he kind of symbolically did things. So he didn't actually battle with Máel Sechnaill for the High Kingship. There was never a pitched battle between them. The king handed over the High Kingship to him in 1002. So
Okay,
what actually,
could you talk us through that? Just like
yeah,
how did that come about?
it came about from Brian basically taking over the areas bit by bit, starting with Ossory, then the southern Connaught, over into Leinster, using these provinces, using these territories, and obviously the incorporated Viking city states, and just essentially moving up. Now, before he became High King, he got to a point where he essentially controlled southern half of Ireland. My big issue as well with the dynasty of the O'Neills is that they were always very focused. Now there was other examples of high kings before that did similar things to Boru, but the problem was they did it a lot more crudely, in my opinion. People would argue against that, but I think there was definitely formality and kind of an aristocracy to what Brian did. And I see with the other ones, there was like, blinding people and, coming down and ripping kings out of there and trying to destroy dynasties and things like that. And I just feel like that when Brian did that with Ivar of Limerick and the two other lads, it stopped then. Everything became much more formal after that. Through might. Like he never actually killed a king after those kings. Never once. He went through a whole process of making alliances and political maneuvering, marriage alliances, and just dominating places through strength. So then, at around the 997 point, himself and Máel Sechnaill had a formal assembly because Máel Sechnaill, I guess, wasn't getting any support. He wasn't getting any. Wasn't making any sort of headway with Boru because wasn't much he could do. They formally agreed upon actually separating Ireland into two halves, Le Maga and Le Cuan. So Le Maga was Brian's southern Ireland, and Le Cuan was Northern Ireland. I'm pretty sure that's the way it goes. And that hadn't been done in a very long time. And that actually goes all the way back to our mythology, actually. Those
Emer's
two
half
have.
and Herman's half.
Yeah, exactly. So that's when then there's a bit of a collaboration between Máel Sechnaill and Brian, and it's actually nice. Like it's kind of a nice period where they kind of get on with each other and they're helping each other out. And in 999, the Battle of Glenmama, this is the next big pitched battle like that Brian takes place, or that it takes place in Brian's career. And what's very interesting about the Battle of Glenmama in 999 is that there was this massive urgency from Boru because it was fought. And actually, I should say something about Máel Sechnaill to give him his credence. he did, and I just want to just give him his credence. I don't want to write him off totally because I do respect him somewhat because he had this really big battle of Tara while Brian was doing his was building his own career as High King of Ireland. He did actually defeat a Viking contingency. He actually defeated Olaf Curran, the last Viking king of Dublin, Olaf Curran, Sigtrygg Silkbeard's father. So I give Máel Sechnaill his credence. He wasn't the total dope, like in my opinion. He was actually a skilled diplomat and actually a skilled fighter as well.
When you say the last High King or the last King of Dublin, do you mean the previous King of Dublin?
Sorry, the last Norse king of Dublin, full Norse king of Dublin.
And
So
was Sitrick Silkenbeard, he was Hiberno Norse?
yeah, Gormlaith was his mother.
Okay,
Yeah,
gotcha.
so Gormlaith was his mother, and Gormlaith would have married Máel Sechnaill, you see. So, but Sigtrygg Silkenbeard actually became stepson of Máel Sechnaill, and then later on stepson of Brian. But so I will say this: Brian defeated the last Norse king of Limerick, and Máel Sechnaill defeated the last Norse king of Dublin. So they both were
Yeah.
equal in that area. Um,
Okay. That's an
yeah,
interesting detail to add in there. And like you kind of already touched off this keeping it in the family. So, as this conversation goes on, I'd like you to explore that whole dynamic a little bit
yeah.
more because I'm sure our listeners who have not heard of any of this before are going to be really interested in who's Gormla and what was the love triangle that was going on
Yeah,
there.
yeah, it's fascinating. It's really fascinating. And I want to just kind of caveat as well about the whole people tend to when they hear oh Vikings fought with Brian and Brian had Vikings fighting on his side and all this in the Highborn and North, they still were quite small numbers. So like let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater on things like, let's not get so extreme. When we say that Brian had like Limerick and Waterford in his battalion. That doesn't mean that they were like, they were head front and center of it. They were a part of it, but they still was majority Gaels, like, you know what I mean? Irish, like. But they were a nice contingency and they did offer nice technology and stuff. So I just needed to say that because people tend to kind of get black and white about stuff. Like they go from it's not Irish versus Vikings at the Battle of Clontarf, and I'll get onto the Gormley thing, to, oh, it was only an interprovincial fight. Oh, it was only a battle for Dublin. So people tend to kind of get very black and white immediately. It was fucking hugely complex. What I would
Yes.
say is the way to look at it is like this. It was mainly Irish, with a nice contingency of Hiberno Norse, with very little Norse left. Okay? And those were the last real true Norse kings. They were gone now, dispatched by Brian and by Máel Sechnaill. What was left was Hiberno Norse. And they were a part of the Irish contingent, the
Okay.
Irish battalions. But they weren't everything about that. Let's just get that clear, like, they weren't everything. So, like, because people will go, they'll kind of go, they'll run with that, like, and they say, oh no, Brian had like Hiberno Norse, and they were, no, they weren't. They were still a small battalion. It was mainly Irish. So his might came from taking over territories, taking over provinces, incorporating the hostages, kings, Gaelic kings becoming his vassals, plus the technology of the Vikings incorporated with their own technology. This is the difference between what Brian offered Ireland and what the northern half offered Ireland. They didn't have that. They were fighting amongst themselves, the northern Neils and southern Neils, which we'll get
Yeah.
into. To talk
Okay.
about the complexity of Gormla, it is hard to know when she divorced Máel Sechnaill. Gormla was a princess of sorry, she was born a princess of Leinster to the King of Leinster, and she was married into Viking Dublin at a very young age, probably between 12, 14, 15 years old, and had Sigtrygg Silkenbeard very young. So Gormley was a fascinating character and actually a TV series. I keep taking TV series because I just think she would be unbelievable as a character because she survived this whole thing, lasted to 1030 AD, and actually, weirdly enough, her two sons were the two sons that survived the Battle of Clontarf. Everybody else died, you know. Um, but her marriage to Máel Sechnaill came after Olaf Curran, who was her previous husband, was defeated at the Battle of Tara by Máel Sechnaill. So, of course, Máel Sechnaill being High King, the spoils of
Oh,
war.
okay. Yes,
Yeah, yeah,
yes.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And something that people don't know about Máel Sechnaill before everybody gets their knickers in a twist about Brian having Norse on his side. Nobody knows this, hardly no one. But Máel Sechnaill had a half Hiberno Norse, he had a half Hiberno Norse brother called Glunarin, who became a kind of a king of Dublin for quite a number of years, as Máel as vassal, like as
But
Máel
this
Sechnaill
this was,
vassal.
I presume, after the Battle of Clontarf, right?
This was before. This was after the Battle of Tara.
Okay, okay. And
So
so
in play
when did the Battle of Tara take place? Just so we can
980,
contextualize it.
980.
980. So you're talking about 24 years in the difference.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, around that 980s. It's around around those years, give or take, in one or 2 years. Sorry, no, it is complex. Like it is a bit like with Irish history, it can be a bit, for any listeners, like it is complicated. We're trying to
Hmm.
make it as uncomplicated as possible, but it's very difficult. And we don't want to give you the generic timeline like everybody else. We actually want to get into the nitty-gritty, but sometimes it does feel like we're going in and out of different scenarios, but we're trying to piece it together and build up to the Battle of
Yeah.
Clontarf.
Thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah, yeah. So after the Battle of Tara, now this was the time when Brian Boru was on the rise. After the Battle of Tara, Olaf Curran was killed. Gormleth was married to Máel Sechnaill. Sigtrygg was already born, a future king of Dublin, a future nemesis of Brian Boru, a future warrior against Brian Boru at Battle of Clontarf. Máel Sechnaill was married to Gormleth at the time. I don't know, did they have any kids, to be honest?
Yeah, that was my next question. I was gonna see like I was gonna ask, did they do the dirty?
Yeah, like it's Sean Duffy has a completely different interpretation. And then the mainstream interpretation of Gormleth I think is complete trash. Actually, Sean's one is closer to mine. The modern interpretation of Gormleth's life is that they got married. She was the last wife of Brian Boru. I don't believe that's the case at all. I actually think she was married much earlier to Brian Boru because Donica Gormleth and Brian's son that was at Clontarf, he was of fighting age. He was leading a battalion down into Leinster. So Gormleth probably got married to Brian when Máel Sechnaill later on, was on the decline, which was absolutely abundantly clear. And it seems like Gormleth, because of where she was born into the courts of Leinster, then was sent to Viking Dublin, then was in the courts of Meath with Máel Sechnaill. I'd say she was attracted to power, like, I think she was attracted to the people, to the ones that were on the rise, that were the most powerful to her, rather than,
Yeah.
you know
But
what I
do you
mean?
think that that's just that was based on the circumstances that she found herself in? Because
Yeah.
you just mentioned that she got married to Olaf at a very young age.
Mm.
So perhaps it was, yes, attracted to power and the rulership, but how much of a choice did she have in that?
Well, the
Because
first one definitely not, but I just think once it came to Máel Sechnaill, because of the unclear scenario between what happened between Máel Sechnaill, Brian, and Gormleth, I'm guesstimating it because I think she had a lot of agency by that age because she was obviously a lot older then, um,
yes,
you
but do you
know.
not do you not see that the point I'm trying to make is that when you're in that lifestyle,
Mm,
it's very hard to give it up.
mm,
I can't imagine Gormla would ever like be content to be a farmer's wife, right?
yeah,
And it's also, I would suggest that it's because she was born into that at a young age. And so that was just the life that she knew. Um, it was the life that she knew. And so perhaps, and I don't know what happened between Máel Sechnaill and Brian Boru, but could it just be a case that, you know, she was passed over to Brian Boru as if she was property?
you know what? It's a good point. It's a very good point. But you see, there is a legend that she divorced Máel Sechnaill. There's a legend because in Brehon law, if you're unhappy as a wife, you can divorce, right?
That's correct, yes. And it was very easy to get divorced. You just had to say it
Yeah.
3 times in front of witnesses.
Yeah, yeah, and you see the reason why I don't take the approach just so know people know because some people might know the legend around her. I don't take the approach that she's the cause of the Battle of Clontarf and all that kind of carry on. She was definitely a part of the world, the machinations and the political sphere. Philip is brilliant in this regard as well because we talked about this in depth as well during our live streams that actually I think it's a disgrace that we don't know more about our high queens and I don't say that's for virtue signaling because a lot of people do that kind of shit nowadays. No, I think it's actually quite fascinating to know the role of the high queen and also because I'm coming at it and you know about this because I learned a lot from your courses and stuff and you talked about this with Philip is that actually you needed a queen to facilitate the ritual of becoming king. And
That's
actually, it
correct,
was it
yeah.
was a very spiritual, ritualized thing. I absolutely adore this side of the Gaelic world. I love
Yeah.
it. I
Well,
absolutely adore it. Like,
just for the listeners who may
yeah.
not be aware of this, it was customary for a high king to marry the land, and
Mm,
the land was symbolized as a goddess of sovereignty.
mm,
So there's this concept in the Brehon law of the woman of sovereignty, and that like the queen actually legitimized the kingship, it legitimized the kingship, and the king had to go through like a ceremony where he married metaphorically married the land. So there's also a legend about the kings of the Picts.
mm,
That was matrilineal. So it was who your mother was. If your mother was a queen, you could be the next king.
mm,
So and it goes further back as well into the Irish legends that a king whose name I can't remember, obviously, um, that these people came from Pictland into Ireland, and they requested the three daughters of the High King to be their
mm,
wives,
mm,
and the High King gave them permission to marry his daughters on the condition that the matrilineal line would be the royal line. Okay,
mm,
so it's in the condition you can marry my daughters, but their children are going to be the future royals of your people, and so on and so forth. So if they had a daughter, they would be. It's a little bit like what happens in Egypt, to be honest. In Egypt, if you weren't aware of this, it's the female that determines who the pharaoh is going to be. It's the mother of the king that's the most important and significant person in the royal
mm,
family.
mm,
So yes, I do, and that actually ties up into that is reflected in the very early Irish mythology, for example, the Partholonians, right? And
mm,
yes, the book was written in whatever century it was written by Christian monks, right? But they're
mm,
writing about a time in pre-Christian Ireland. And there was a case of the Partholonians where, a long story, boring, the Partholon, he was a guy who came with all of his like followers. He liked to hunt, so he went out for hunting, and he left his wife Delgnat at home.
mm,
And Delgnat, she found herself to be tempted by a male servant, and she ended up sleeping with the male servant. And to add insult to injury, her and the male servant, who incidentally was called Topa, drank out of his cup, Partholon's cup. Now, when Partholon returned from the hunt, he drank from his cup, and he knew magically, that the infidelity had taken place.
mm,
And Delgnat Delgnat's response to this, she was like, "Oh, Partholon, leaving me alone with a man is like leaving milk before a cat, honey before a child." And this is the thing, right?
mm,
I hope my listeners don't hate me for this, but even back then,
mm,
even back then, you could see that they knew that women were very good at manipulating men with their words.
mm, mm, mm,
And so, what did Partholon do? As a reaction to this, he ended up killing the dog, not the servant and not his wife, but the dog, and that dog's name was Samir. And I still remember what the judgment was. It's like with very noble judgment that it is the right of the wife to recover against the husband. And this is described as the very first judgment in Ireland, with a noble judgment at that. And
Wow.
so this comes back to the, I know I went on a big spiel
No,
there,
it's great.
but
Yeah.
this comes back to the idea of the queen having a right to recover against the king. And but it didn't say it's the right of the queen. It said it's the right of the wife to recover against the husband. So the judgment was that Partholon had to pay restitution.
Hmm.
And what restitution did he pay? He gave Delgnat an island, and this island still exists up in Donegal. And she
Wow.
named it Inish Samer after the dog.
Wow.
And
That
it's
is
still called
amazing.
Inish Samer today. And if you go up there, there's a little plaque and it tells you the story.
Wow.
So, yeah, that was a big long spiel to say that, women were very important in early Ireland. And as you go on through time, that status deteriorates a little bit,
Yeah. Yeah.
or a lot, because as Christianity grew, the status of women
Yeah.
declined.
Yeah.
Um, but there would have definitely been elements of the old Gaelic order in the then what was then modern Irish society. Um, so yes, that's just like wraps up that point that Phil and I were talking about, and just to give you a little bit more detail.
Yeah. Yeah, and so it's there. And I was thinking Partholon the whole time. My name in Irish is Oscuelga is Partholon. You know, it's just
That's very interesting. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. It is very interesting. The Partholonians is so cool. But like yeah. So the thing with that becomes clear from this moment on, and because of what the subsequent events and the characters that were involved in this, it does become a family affair. Like it becomes a huge family feud in the end. Now it's not that's not the reason for it, but like Máel Sechnaill was married to Gormla. It's unclear did they have any children. I don't think they did. Then Gormla got married to Brian. When is up for debate, right? Um, Sean has it as I think it probably was the second or third wife, right? And it was obviously a status symbol for both. And it was and I don't believe it happened when he became High King. I believe it happened before that because remember he became King of Southern half of Ireland first, And also as well, it seemed that Máel Sechnaill probably it could have been a mutual divorce as well because maybe she did it just didn't work out maybe he didn't remember he did defeat Olaf Curran. She had a child with Olaf Curran. you know um Maybe there was some sort of dispute or something and she just they just it wasn't a situation that they wanted to be in you know um but anyway, the point is that Gormla would have offspring, um, one that was already, in place, Sigtrygg Silkbeard, and then offspring with Brian, Donnacha MacBrian, who would both become very prominent members of Irish society, and both would survive Battle of Clontarf. So were we at the point of Southern? Were we at the point when Máel Shack? Oh, we were at the point of Glenmama, yeah, the battle, right? The Battle of Glenmama, which was the first pitched battle and weirdly enough, because we're such a warring nation, and I said we were such warring people, that was the only pitched battle that took place between then and the Battle of Clontarf, which is 15 years for Brian's career. So it took 15 more years for an actual big pitched battle to take place. But the Battle of Clonmama was interesting because it was actually against the belligerents of the Battle of Clontarf as well. So this was an actual fight, a battle that would mimic the Battle of Clontarf at a much
Yeah,
smaller
that's
scale.
that's a very interesting point.
Yeah, yeah. And the other thing is as well, and I had this thing with Philip, and it's kind of like my Quentin Tarantino fantasy where I want to rewrite history and have Brian actually just slaughter these two boys at the Glenmama like he did with Ivar of Limerick because it would have saved him a lot of hassle maybe. But you see that was the difference between Brian's um you know plans then was not to do that anymore. His plans was to actually always to deal with these people in a formal way. So when Glenmama happened, it was around December, which was unusual. We don't know. Well, I think I know the reason why he did it was for Dublin to gain control of Dublin because Sigtrygg Silkbeard at that time was a king of Dublin, and Máel Morda, who was actually Gormlai's brother, was trying to be king of Leinster, but he wasn't having any success. And he was doing all sorts of kind of things in Leinster, which was under Brian's domain. Like he was trying to do things in Leinster, like taking Leinster king hostage, and this is the reason why this battle happened. So when the battle was won, Brian, remember he's Southern, the king of Southern Ireland, and Máel Sechnaill is the king of Northern Ireland, the northern half of Ireland. When this battle was won, Brian just took Dublin, and this was now a part of his domain. And then I think what actually started to kind of become very apparent was that Máel Sechnaill didn't really have any more power, like because if you think about it, Brian had the southern half of Ireland and now Dublin. So you had
So what
Dublin.
year are you talking about here?
This is right after the Battle of Glenmama, 999 AD.
All right, so you're saying that Brian Boru had control of Dublin from that time onwards?
Yeah, and I think that's the reason why he was so eager to have this battle.
Hmm.
I think he actually
When you
planned. I
say
think
this battle, do you mean the Battle of Glenmama or
Glenmama,
okay,
Glenmama.
okay.
Remember, this is the first. This is the battle between the same belligerents of Clontarf, but
Hmm.
this happened in 999 while Brian was king of Le Maga. So after this, Brian took control of Dublin, and then it wouldn't be long before Máel Sechnaill would hand over the High Kingship because Brian, I think, probably just realized, look, listen,
Yeah.
I'm dominant
Well,
here.
just to paint the picture that like most of Ireland was rural,
Yeah.
but there were some strong economic centers, and possibly the strongest was the Viking settlement in Dublin,
Mm,
because of the geographic location, because it has access to many rivers,
mm,
and that's where all the trade would come
mm,
through.
mm.
So I understand why Brian would see this as a necessary addition to his kingdom, and also why, if whoever controls Dublin controls Ireland, let's just put it like that.
Yeah.
Um, and that was the same when the Brits came, when the British
Yep.
Anglo-Normans and the Pale and later Britain, England,
Yep.
they controlled Dublin, and do you know that that's why we're called Jackeens in Dublin, is because
Yeah.
we were flying the Union Jack.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
so anyway, that's jumping forward a little bit in the history, but I just wanted to add that little
No, it's
detail in there.
true. Yeah, yeah, and it's very correct. And I think maybe Brian knew this, like he knew that he controlled all the Viking ports. Remember the naval fleets that would be useful here. And what actually started happening in this time was that it was just a realization that he was the most powerful. And what actually started happening then was Brian was actually going up into uh, Mead. He was literally just going up into the territory of Máel Sechnaill, and symbolically, he actually marched on Tara. You believe it or not, and I just think again, TV series epic moment, season finale, marching on Tara, like not only with like the southern half of Ireland, but now with Sigtrygg Silkenbeard as well. His new vassal, who he actually married his daughter off to. So this is a
Yes,
new
yes.
politically speaking, he started doing this, marrying his daughter. And actually, I forgot to say earlier on, and Owenukta, the son of Malloy of Desmond, Cian survived, and actually he married his daughter to him as well.
Hmm.
So, and actually Cian became a loyal servant of Brian. So, like,
Interesting.
this is
So,
what's
so
happening.
there was all sorts of alliances going on that were for political gain, and he was using marriages to secure his
Yeah.
his control as
And
well.
he was doing that himself. He married like his first wife was a princess of Connacht, and that was his first wife, Princess More, Princess of Connacht. He had two Connacht wives, one Leinster wife, and one wife of Mead,
Hmm.
Southern
And
Mead,
and the Leinster wife was Gormlaill, right?
Gormla. Yeah,
And
exactly.
were the other wives alive?
More died. They all died. This is another tragedy of of medieval world. They all
I mean,
died. Every one
did
of
he
them.
have multiple wives at one time, or
I think what actually the way it played out was more was his first wife. She died.
hmm
Then either Ecrid or Gormla was next, and or they were one of them because Ecrid was actually of Connacht as well. Oh, sorry, Mead. Or sorry, an obscure kingdom of the southern Eels. So you can see what's going on here. You see, so another son was born, Tig, who actually survived Battle of Clontarf because he actually stayed back in Munster. Um, but I actually think Gormla and Ecrid were married around the same time, and I think this was probably a major
yeah.
issue for Gormla. Yeah.
So I know that polygamy existed in early Ireland. Um, what was the attitude of the church towards Brian Boru at this time, and what was the attitude of Brian Boru towards the church? I know he visited Armagh and he seen the Book of Armagh, and he was so impressed by it that he made, I believe it was 12 ounces of gold. Did you maybe you could correct me on that? But did the church have an opinion on him having potentially having multiple wives at this time? And um, what was the church's general view of Brian Boru and Brian Boru's view of the church?
Mm. Well, the Armagh incidents would come later on when he's High King in 1005. But in general, it seems, although we had that moment when he went into the Scattery Island monastery and did what he did, maybe that was a kind of a something that's haunted him, and maybe this is why he had such a good relationship with the church because I mentioned his older brother Markin. Do you remember Markin? So
Yes, yes.
he became a hugely prominent abbot and figure in the ecclesiastical world, especially in the Munster area. And there actually is it's quite interesting the relationship with the church and the kings because it was a kind of symbiotic nature and also quite destructive at times in terms of the Gaelic kings with the monasteries and things because people kind of assume that Vikings were the only ones raiding monasteries, but actually no, Gaelic kings did the same, and the reason why they did it, and this just to give you an overview of the relationship. The reason why they did that, let's just say Mahon, his older brother, was actually one that raided Clonmacnoise. So you know where Clonmacnoise is on the River Shannon. The reason that was done was it's quite obvious when you think about it. It was in the territory of the king that they were attacking, you know. So it was so that's a type of skirmish, a type of raiding, a type of tit for tat kind of stuff, saying that we're here, we're taking you on kind of thing. This happened with Gaelic kings in the churches. So what you needed to have was the churches needed protection. They also needed refortification. They needed yeah, protection essentially. It's kind of like what we were talking about the cartels earlier on, like we'll
Yeah.
give you protection.
This is
And
a
then
nice monastery you have here. It'd be a shame if anything happened to it.
it
Not
is, yeah.
blowing
And
the
it's like
candle.
you do and then the because I know that blind boy guy, like, he did a documentary on RT. I don't know if you saw it, did you?
Yeah, I did. It's about Saint Patrick and the monasteries. Is that the one you're talking about?
It's one about the basically Saint scholars and slaves, he
That's
called it.
Saint Scholars and Saves. That's right. Yeah.
Now, I took huge offense to a lot of it. And now I did think there was some good points in it, but I just thought it was like baby out with the bathwater. Like, it was like, slavery was like, slavery not in their mind is like is the biggest thing
Yeah.
ever. Everybody was
It comes back to the point that we were talking about earlier, that the knee-jerk reaction from people when they hear slavery, but they don't
yes.
understand the actual nuance of it. And it's the same today in America, where they're a certain demographic are complaining about slavery and as if they're the only race that ever suffered it, but they forget that the word slave comes from Slav, and I hate to break it to them, but they're not from Africa. Slavs are not from Africa, they're from Europe. So Yeah, but I don't want to interrupt your point.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No,
go
no,
on.
definitely any time because it's always very educational. I'm not saying that to blow smoke. Like it genuinely, like every time you're coming in with something, I'm learning something, and I'm being reminded as well because I did a couple of your courses, and I remember like you're reading up on this or listening to you talk about this before as well. But the reason I'm kind of giving that context is because what you had was a very complex situation. So they the symbiotic nature of Brian and the church did kind of present itself early on in his career. And you see these kind of writings into the records and stuff, and I'll be honest, the academics pointed these out for me. Like I didn't get see these in the primary source; they pointed them out. Like, and they're quoting primary sources that there was times when Brian was absolutely obsessed with fixing problems in the church, like even early on before he was High King, because it seemed like he understood that um, Christianity was the dominant religion, the dominant culture, politically and spiritually and stuff. And obviously, because he was going to self-style and be styled as by the Bishop of Armagh and his old tutor and chief doctor of Ireland as Emperor of the Gael, it's obvious, like because of these connections, that they knew about the Roman empires, the emperors. They knew about Charlemagne and his whole the Christian symbiotic nature he had with the Pope. The Pope was asking him for help, and then Charlemagne gave him help, and then he became an emperor, right? So I think that's the very rudimentary way of explaining what happened there. But obviously, Brian kind of had this idea that what was important was to have the church incorporated into your arsenal as well, because of course the church was an important mouthpiece for the political scene. So not only was in Munster was Brian looked at as an upstart by the kings, but also by the church in the beginning. So they were a bit uncomfortable with Brian's rise and becoming the new king of Munster because they were so used to the Oanachtas. Because again, the Oanachtas were the traditional kings of Munster, like the O'Neills were in Ireland. So the church took a bit of time. And I guess Brian kind of probably would have rocked up to the church, and much like him rocking up in a probably different guise now, like with maybe 300 men outside the door and kind of being all gracious at the front door and saying, look, it's a new dawn, I can offer you this. But they're like, but you're not who we've been dealing with for the last couple of hundred years or whatever, right? But he's like, but it's a new dawn. I can offer you this. And I guess these churches had to get in line. So what Brian started doing was, and I can't remember the exact specifics, but he started sorting out problems for these churches, especially down towards the Cork region, Waterford region, and South Tipperary and stuff. He started doing things for them and getting them in line with him. So then you start seeing his brother Markin becoming abbot of kind of monasteries further and further away from his own kingdom. So he started actually becoming the biggest abbot in the area as well. So you could see that there's this rise of not just Brian, but also his brother Markin in the
That's
ecclesiastical
really
force.
interesting, isn't it? It just
It's
adds a
so
whole other
fascinating.
dynamic, a whole other perspective into the saga that is Brian Boru.
Absolutely. And just to quickly sum it all up, right, and to get like kind of come right ahead to Armagh, even though we probably should go back a little bit afterwards and just explain the kingship, high kingship. Um, I believe, again, after looking at it in depth, that Markin was a huge influence over Brian. He was an older brother of Brian. He died in 1010, right? So he would have seen Brian become Emperor of the Gael. He would have seen Brian become High King, Southern King of Ireland. He was there the whole time. And Brian was, giving him the leg up as well in this world, right? But I think his was a huge influence because I think he surrounded himself with a lot of people. Brian did, like obviously his brothers. He learned from his father, his brothers. He surrounded himself from the people of Inishfallen, Máel, Sutan O'Carroll, who was actually the guy who wrote it into the Book of Armagh, who was his tutor on Inishfallen. You know, so these people were around him. He had a retinue of people. He had a retinue of advisors, And then once the churches were in line, they were all backing him. Like, this was the point. It wasn't just military might, it was political and spiritual might. So this was all building and building, building, building towards him becoming High King, and then obviously subsequently after that becoming Emperor of the Gael in 1005. So this was a huge part of Brian's career. And to answer your question about the polygamy, I'm going to be honest, I don't know much about it. I don't know much other than I have read that it wasn't, because we were kind of an insular Christians at the time. Um, some say Celtic Christians, insular is probably better. Somewhat, we were semi-autonomous with Rome, but we were definitely doing our own thing here, like, you know what I mean? And I didn't think that kind of leads into right the Norman conquests, as a part of the Norman conquest as well, was to
Yeah,
get the Irish Church in line,
I
And we
agree.
know we both read a certain author that you talked about recently, a very interesting author. I don't know, should I mention him? Conor McDarry, who has a unique understanding of all of this, and it's a very fascinating thing to think that was Rome at war with the Irish Church as well? And was Rome afraid of this kind of emperor of the Gael, like, a
Yeah,
holy emperor of Ireland, like, you know
yeah.
what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So about the actual marriages and things, I actually genuinely think the Gaelic culture was not totally in line with that type of Christianity,
Yes. Yeah.
so that kind of backtracks on my on my on my
Well,
idea of the Norse not
I
being
have
in.
a I have a theory, and I believe it's true, but it's only a theory, that the main reason why the Roman Church, etc., wanted to invade Ireland is because we were the only country in Europe at the time, the only group of people, the Gaels, that didn't take the authority to rule from the Pope.
Mm,
And that was always going to be a threat to papal dominion over what was then called Christendom. And that's why, and I don't really want to go into too much detail in this, but that's why you see that when the Tudors came along and Henry VIII broke away from the church and said, "I'm now King of Ireland." That was the first time he declared himself as King of Ireland, right?
yeah, yeah.
Because people forget that both Britain, the people of Britain, and the people of Ireland were all Catholics at the time when the Normans invaded, 1166. Um, it wasn't until around, and you can correct me on this if I'm wrong, but it was around 1600s, or it was when the Tudor dynasty came and Henry VIII.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
that's when the Protestant church was
yeah.
created. And you don't have an explicit condemnation from the Vatican.
Mm,
Because my theory is that they didn't care if it was Catholic or Protestant so long as it wasn't Gaelic.
mm,
So long as it wasn't Gaelic. And that would tie in loosely to that author that you just mentioned, Conor McDarry.
mm.
That's the thing with Conor McDarry. I can't accept everything he says because it's so out there, but at the same time, I find it very hard to dismiss.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
There's definitely a true line in it that's very, very real. Um, because what you get is that you kind of get these arguments that no, Ireland was under fully under the Roman authority at that time within the church, and it's like that's a load of nonsense because the Christian monks at the time were doing stuff that nobody else was doing across Europe, like
yeah,
especially the golden age of Ireland, like. Philip is a huge, I feel I keep saying Philip, but Philip from Irish medieval history, how we got in touch, kind of essentially um, you know, uh, talks about the golden age of Ireland in such a unique way, and actually, obviously there's books on it as well, but I don't think the full Roman authority came with the Norman conquest. So at this particular time, we were kind of doing our own type of Christianity. Now there was massive, massive, massive elements from the way the Roman Church were doing their Christianity.
Hmm.
But like, you
Yeah,
know,
but there was also like Roman Britain,
mm,
and that was at the time that St. Patrick came to Ireland.
mm,
He was a Roman Christian,
yeah.
and so it would be wrong of us to assume that there was no influence from
No,
the Roman
they were
Church.
speaking Latin. It was written down.
Yes.
They were speaking. Sorry, in the church they were speak. They wrote down things down in Latin. Like so,
Yeah.
come on, like it's definitely there.
Yeah.
But it just was the fact. You know what I often think. I don't know if you've ever thought about this. Our place in the world, logistically, in Europe, in the world, like it protected us for a long, long, long time. It kind of secured our insular kind of nature for such a long, long time, and it created this kind of bastion of the last kind of defense of your the last defense of the last defense of our own world. You know what I mean? The Gaelic world, but we were the last literal point in Europe, like.
Yeah.
And it was inevitable, really, that eventually we would be conquered because it's this wave upon wave upon wave upon wave over generations. But it was amazing how long we lasted. It's amazing that we
Yeah.
lasted to the Norman conquest. Um, so yeah, like yeah, to kind of to sum it all up in terms of the Roman Church and the Catholic Church and Christianity, it was a hugely massive important machinations in Brian's plans, and it was definitely a 100% a massive priority for him to keep the churches, very much built. And something actually as well that should be noted, the island monasteries were massively important in this
Yeah,
time.
like Iona and
Yeah, there's
yeah.
loads. There's loads. I mean, even in Scattery Island where the lads were slaughtered, that was a monastery.
Yeah.
Inishkahig, I think, is Holy Island, I think. I think it's in Ishkai, in Loughdurg. There's loads of them. There's actually loads of them. So it was a big thing, like the aesthetic lifestyle. There was loads of them. There was actually, even where Brian's forts are, his palace, where his palace was, King Cora, St. Flannan's Church in Killaloe. They actually have a part of the old monastery that was actually on the one of the islands of the Shannon. They had to take it off because of
Yeah.
the hydroelectric kind of stuff on the Shannon, and it flooded it. So there was all these islands, and this was massively important to them as
Yeah.
well. Yeah.
That's interesting. All right. Let's move forward then to the Battle of Clontarf,
Yeah.
which took
Okay.
place in 1014.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
was the what were the key events and the causes that led up to the Battle of Clontarf in 1014?
Absolutely. Let's do it. So let's just go through the timeline real quick. Máel Sechnaill submitted to Brian in 1002 AD. It just became absolutely apparent. You've hopefully everybody's listened for the last 2 hours. It's quite clear Brian's power just literally overtook the southern half of Ireland and came up into Meath, Connacht, and he submitted to Brian 1002, formally handed over his High Kingship of Ireland to Brian. No pitched battle, nothing, handed it over. Máel Sechnaill, weirdly enough, was trying to get the Northern O'Neills involved. This is all a part of the story of Battle of Clontarf. There is actually machinations from the north as well. Máel Sechnaill, in a desperate attempt, tried to stop Brian from taking it. He tried to get the Northern O'Neills involved, and this is a big part of what I was saying earlier on. The Northern O'Neills are a lot to blame for Brian's rise and for Brian actually taking what he did, because they
Okay.
didn't help. They didn't help Máel Sechnaill at all. They were
So
so
could you speak a little bit more on that detail?
Yeah, definitely. They were too busy warring with each other, and they were warring with each other up there. I mean, there were some real crazy things happening during that time. When Máel Sechnaill he actually offered can you believe this? The high kingship to one of the kings of the north, and he refused it because he said, "I don't want to be getting involved in your shit." You know what I mean? Because he was so busy warring with the Northern O'Neill clans that he didn't accept it. So Máel Sechnaill had to hand it over to Brian because he didn't get any support from the Northern O'Neills. The Northern O'Neills still didn't take Brian seriously until he actually marched on to Dundalk and to the place where Cuchulainn fought off um, Queen Maeve's men.
RD, right?
Yeah. Up, is it RD? It's just outside Dundalk. I think it's his birthplace.
Okay.
And I think there is a it's his birthplace for sure, but I thought it was actually the place where that was the choke point into Ulster, because it was the choke point then as well. Is it RD he fought off the Queen Maeve's men, is it? Because
Well,
maybe
it was RD where he had the battle with Ferdia.
Ferdia. I think this.
And that means like RD means like aha Ferdia, right?
Yeah, yeah. But I think this point, anyway, it's definitely his birthplace. So look, we won't spend too much time in it. But the symbiotic nature of this, sorry, the symbolic nature of this place. What Brian did then from that moment, so it wasn't just taking the High Kingship. See, this is the difference between Brian and everybody else. He didn't just take the High Kingship and sit back and mead or whatever and have loads of babies and just spoils of war. No, he started campaigning in the north. Campaigning in the north, unsuccessful, became successful over extended campaigns. And there was one guy in the north that became very, very, very important and actually is important in the story of the Battle of Clontarf. Flaherty of the Cenél Nogan. No, Nogan. I'm always getting that wrong. Or Owen. I think the Cenél Owen.
Kennel known, and that's like
Yeah,
they're based around what we now call Tyrone, which is owned by.
exactly.
Yeah,
But it would have been Cenél Owen and the Cenél Connell were the two kind of dominant tribes.
yeah, and Donegal used to be called Tir Connell.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's
so
right.
you had Tyrone, which is like the land of Owen's descendants, and Tir Connell, which is the land of Connell's descendants. And for those who don't know, a little interesting fact is that those two, Connell and Owen, were the sons of Niall of the Nine Hostages.
Nice. And they're still mighty men to this day. Half my family's from Donegal, you know.
Oh
So
yeah.
they're still mighty men to this day, the Donegal men and women and Tyrone people as well.
Yeah, they're rebels.
Yeah,
And that was
completely.
the thing with Ulster, like Ulster was the last province to fall.
Yeah.
It was the last of the Gaelic like high
Yeah.
chieftainships to submit. And now they're the most British province. And it's really sad when I was reading about the history of Ireland and I got to that point, I was like, hold on a second. Like the O'Neills and the O'Donnells
Mm,
were the two last chieftains who gave the last stand.
mm. By this, so we're talking like in 1005, he was announced, pronounced as emperor, proclaimed as emperor of the Gael in Armagh, something just an unbelievable thing to have happened. No, it's never happened before. It never happened in the history of Ireland. There was this new emperor of the Gael, but of course, it took a while to submit all of the Northern Neil clans. Eventually, it happened in 1011 with the Cenél Connell, and actually, Flaherty, who had been causing so many problems, was a part of that submission process. He went up with Brian and submitted. Again, Brian married his daughter to Flaherty, and eventually in 1011, Brian submitted every single king in Ireland. It's never been done before, never done since, and he was the only one to ever
Really?
be. Never been done. Never submitted every. No other king did that. Did that.
That's fascinating because whenever you read about the High Kingship, right, there's a romantic idea that the High King of Ireland meant that all the other kings were in submission to him, but that wasn't always the case. I mean, and I didn't realize that Brian was the only one. I
He was
assumed
the only one.
that
Nobody.
there was a
Yeah,
couple of clans who were in opposition to his claim, but that just makes him so much more interesting and so much more legendary.
yeah. Well, I think this in opposition thing is quite interesting because I just think there's always someone opposed to your kingship. It doesn't matter if you're the best king in the world. There's just always someone that's not happy, like, you know.
Yeah.
So this thing is like I think it's overstated at times because it was who was most powerful. It was who was most capable at the time that was the High King, really. Now, Brian did something different. He went beyond. He was. It's just ridiculous when you look at the campaigns into the north. And now he was in his late 60s, early 70s, like, by the time it gets to the Battle of Clontarf. And he's still powering up into the north to deal with rebellions and do all these things. And you start to see as well that he's building up the church influence as well in the middle of the country. Obviously, Armagh's under his control. Armagh as well is the seat of the ecclesiastical seat of Ireland, the capital of Ireland in terms of the ecclesiastical nature of it. St. Patrick would have done a lot of work in that area, our Macha, because it was a real pagan site. So this was all symbolic. Brian was 100% now, like, in all areas, he was the High King. Like, he was the Emperor of the Irish. And 1011, it all kind of it all stopped in terms of like everything was under his dominion, everything, And we were talking before the live stream. The last king was a Cinel Conall king, right? And he was brought. We were talking about, and there was no pitched battles, by the way. It was campaigns. It was just going up, showing what was there, and they were just like, "Oh my dear God." No, we're not accepting. Give us a bit of time and come back up. And then they come back up. They're like, okay, we accept. I'm your vassal. Then they would return. One king returned back to King Cora with Brian. So imagine they hopped onto the old motorway to Shannon and came down. And I just imagine, and Philip was great in the kind of imagination of this as well. It's like Brian kind of like, being a great host to this guy. Like, listen, it's all in misunderstanding. Just come, you're coming down to King Cora. We're going to show you the palace, feed you. You're going to get a nice gift. You're going to be the best vassal in the world. You're under my dominion. This is not going to be like other times when people are taking each other's eyes out. There's probably all this kind of talk and smooth talking. If they didn't, if he didn't submit before that, they were going to go to war because at that point, imagine this, right? And this is actually in Sean Duffy's book for anybody that doesn't believe me. There was a three-prong attack to the last High King. There was one right up to the north of Donegal, south of Donegal, and a naval campaign right around the rear end of Donegal. So he was
Right.
literally
Mhm.
forced into that submission. Then in these years, Brian was doing a lot of refortification, building. There was a building blitz that was written into the annals of Ireland. There was a lot of talk about literature being bought from Europe, rewriting of lost books. You know what I mean? There's so many lost books. It's just insane. They reckon that Brian was involved with doing some of the last rewriting the last books and stuff because he was very much an educated guy, wanted to educate, rebuilt his palaces and things like that. But in all of this time, Sigtrygg Silkbeard of Dublin, Máel of Leinster, and Flaherty again of the Northern Eneals. It seems to me that they started communicating with each other and they weren't liking the fact that Máel Sechnaill was right in the middle of them and that he was essentially Brian's not right hand man, but he was kind of the next king down from Brian. That he was kind of still held the King of Tara position, right? Which was definitely symbolic at this point. It was just a kind of a ceremonial kind of a holding
Yeah.
point at that time. But they started kind of having goes off, especially Flaherty started having kind of little things with Máel Sechnaill. And Máel Sechnaill again was quite weak in the way he dealt with it, And this all culminated then in the Battle of Clontarf. So what actually started happening is that Máel of Leinster, who was Gormlaith's brother, Sigtrygg's uncle, and at this point, I believe Gormlaith was divorced from Brian. Brian actually had a fourth wife, Dub Coblug, that was dead by this point. She was of Connacht as well. So I think Gormlaith was back in the city walls of Dublin. Sigtrygg Silkenbeard, Máel There's this whole legendary story about tantrums and political stuff happening in the courts of Brian. Nobody really knows about any of that because they reckon it was written in the Scandinavian folklore and that's where it comes from, Scandinavian records.
Yeah. Just
Maybe that
most
happened.
likely, well, anything written by the enemy, there's probably going to be a little bit of propaganda in there as well, in the sense that the only things that the only writings that we have about the Druids are from Caesar's diaries.
Yeah,
So you have to take those accounts with a pinch of salt.
absolutely. A whole pinch of salt, and it's very interesting because those Scandinavian sources blame Gormlaith for the Battle of Clontarf. Nothing about the 2,000 potentially minimum, maybe 5,000 actual Vikings from the Kingdom of the Isles coming in. But anyway, so there was a point before this that Sigtrygg Silkenbeard he actually after the Battle of Glenmama left Dublin for a while, but he negotiated himself back in. I do believe that Sigtrygg actually went to the Kingdom of the Isles and did have conversations. This all line, with people of the Kingdom of the Isles, not happy with the fact that he was beaten, and but he was a skilled diplomat and a very, very interesting individual called the Great Survivor. And the Battle of Clontarf was a culmination of a rebellion from the Leinster contingency, which was under Máel and the Citric city-state of Dublin, obviously under Sigtrygg, and then the mercenaries that were brought in from the Kingdom of the Isles as far as Orkney, and some say far beyond that. Now, Philip has educated me in this, and actually, Sean Duffy does a lot of work on this as well. And when we had a chat on my birthday there recently, he does think a lot of the fallout from England at the time with Sven Forkbeard, because England was conquered by the Vikings, actually had a Viking king of England. We never had anything like that. They were always kept at bay, kept to the bays. They reckon that a lot of these mercenaries that were fighting for them at the time were probably among this contingency or battalions of Vikings because they were like, they wanted something, like they needed something to do. And Citric probably promised them a lot. Where the baby goes out with the bathwater in several ways is that it was the Vikings versus the Irish. No, it wasn't. It was a rebel alliance with the Highborn North city-state of Dublin and Viking mercenaries. So it wasn't Irish versus Vikings, because Brian did have, as we already talked about, contingencies or battalions of Highborn North in his
Yes,
arsenal, right? So there's that complexity to it, but it's actually then sorry, it's sorry, I'm getting a little bit crosswired there now. But then it's not just a battle for Dublin or just an inter-provincial battle between Munster and Leinster. Like, this is a ridiculous oversimplification of it as well, because it's a beautiful video by Clans and Dynasties on YouTube, who is a very, very, very interesting guy that I really recommend anybody to watch, who fought at the Battle of Clontarf. And this guy has he's not an academic himself, but he has had people peer review his work. And from the academic circles, this is what he said to me anyway, that he reckons up to two-thirds of Irish surnames, or sorry, it's up to two-thirds of the battalions that fought for Brian at Clontarf, the two-thirds of Ireland Gaelic clans were represented at the Battle of Clontarf. Not two-thirds of Ireland, but two-thirds of the clans of Ireland, the names of Ireland, were represented at the Battle of Clontarf. So,
that's pretty impressive, right? So I
absolutely.
guess what I'm taking from that is that two-thirds of Ireland was represented at the Battle of Clontarf, which essentially you're saying, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so correct me if I'm wrong here, that in practical terms, it's almost as if all of the island was was present in the Battle of
Yeah,
Clontarf.
pretty much, because a good section of Ulster wasn't, but there was a good section of Ulster that was, and there's a good section of Connacht that wasn't, but there's also a very good section of Connacht that was. The full length of Munster, a lot of Ossory, a part of Leinster, obviously the city states of Waterford, Cork, Limerick. Then we, as I mentioned in the beginning, there was Scottish lords that came over to add to the battalion as well. Also potentially people that went against Sigtrygg, Osbach of Man, Brodir's brother, the guy that would end up killing Brian, he potentially came over and joined Brian's ranks as well. Um, so yeah, there was like a good section of of Ireland involved with the battle. That's not to say that every single warrior of two-thirds of Ireland under those names were at Clontarf, but it's the two-thirds of Irish clans at the time were represented. How many of those people actually turned up is up for debate, but those names were present. You know what I mean? So
Okay. So
yeah,
how accurate is it to say that the narrative of Clontarf was a decisive Irish victory over the Vikings? How quickly after the Battle of Clontarf, and I know that we didn't completely expel the Vikings because some of them are still here today, right? Hiberno
mm,
Norse and so on. But how quickly did it take for the political changes to take effect? And maybe you could also talk about how Brian Boru's death, how did that affect the legacy of his work, of his accomplishments?
Mm, absolutely. Yeah. Well, to kind of go in part there, the first part of your question, about the was this like the eradication of Viking influence? I think that's pretty much what you're asking. No, like what I think actually was the case was this was the last attempt of Norse, because Norse were involved in this, these mercenaries. Like Sigurd of Orkney, who was a commander in the army, was full Norse, like, you know what I mean? What was he doing here? Was he here for the was he just a simple mercenary? Listen, I believe these guys were coming to fucking get some power, to take some dominion, to take some territory. They were offered a lot. They were here to, for God's sake, they were constantly trying to conquer places. They were trying to conquer England. Why do people find it hard to think that these Vikings that came in with Sigtrygg and in with Leinster weren't here to take some sort of control? I also would argue that if Brian Brian's army were unsuccessful and he was killed, Sigtrygg could have claimed High Kingship of Ireland. Would it have been an actual full fact? No, but he could have claimed it. Why not? He just defeated the High King of Ireland and won. Why couldn't he claim it?
The Emperor of the Scots.
There you go. He could be Emperor of the Scots and the foreigners. You see? Because so, and then to answer part of
Okay.
the next part of your question is the political the political kind of, scenario around this. The Hiberno Norse, as we've already said, were a part of the Irish lifestyle and culture and society. It wasn't an eradication of them because they were already blended into our society. What it was eradication of was the last eradication, sorry, the last attempt of a Viking invasion, which it was. Thousands of Viking warriors came onto the shores of Ireland that day. So this was an invasion. And that was, I believe, it was the last of that. Because you have people saying about Magnus Barelegs about 100 years later. You examine that, that's not the same thing. He did not come onto the shores with that many people. He was actually infiltrating himself into Dublin and doing all this kind of machinations with Gaelic kings and things like that. It wasn't the same thing. So that was I believe that was the last eradication of Norse influence in the sense of invading Ireland, right? That's what I believe. The actual aftermath of the defeat of Sigtrygg's army and on Dublin, this was Sigtrygg's final hurrah. Like once they were defeated and the Gaelic victory was in place and Máel Sechnaill took over, Sigtrygg didn't really do anything after that. Honest to God, he really didn't.
So, if I'm hearing you right, you're saying Sigtrygg didn't die in the Battle of
He didn't
Clontarf.
die. He was in the Dublin city walls.
Okay.
Everybody else died, bar himself and Donncha,
And okay,
more or less
so
sons.
describe Brian Boru's death because I know he died at the Battle of Clontarf, and maybe you could talk a little bit about how he was found, who killed him, and I believe he was found in prayer, but that could be more of a legendary telling of the account. And as a following on question from that, like why didn't Sigtrygg Silkenbeard do anything? Like what was stopping him from proclaiming the High Kingship of Ireland?
Right. Good questions. So if, I would like to just add, because I haven't advertised myself at all, but I actually have a book written called The Forgotten Prince, and it's a historical fiction based on the academic work, um, and it is actually detailing, the Battle of Clontarf, but from a historical fiction perspective, Donncha. It's through the protagonist of Donncha, Brian in his tent, and Brodir of Man. So in that story, I don't deviate from what is the kind of consensus of how Brian died, which is, so I'm not kind of giving away anything really. This is the consensus. You can read this anywhere, even on Wikipedia, pretty much. Um, Brian, the Gaelic warriors were successful that day, and they even pinpointed the high tides. Everything about the story adds up because there was scientific research done into this in Trinity College, where they pinpointed the actual high tides was 5:30 in the morning, and that
Yeah.
and 12 hours later. So the whole story about the Vikings trying to retreat and the boats being scattered, not being able to get back on,
Yeah,
this adds up.
there's also the fact that the in the accounts that they made an early landing
Yeah. Yeah.
on the beach, and then I was listening to a podcast about this recently, and there were three scholars on the podcast. Um, they seem to suggest that this proves the accounts are accurate, at least in regards to the early rise, and then the accounts at the end of the day. So we said it was like 12 hours later, so say like 5 o'clock in the afternoon or evening. How their ships were scattered, and there's accounts of many people actually drowning as they're
Mm,
trying to get away from the
absolutely.
armies of Brian Boru.
Even tragically, Brian Boru's grandson drowned as well, which is recorded. Yeah, there was many people drowned that day, and the Viking warriors were completely decimated. I mean, they were slaughtered. Like, and they reckon it happened around Fairview, the Tolka Fairview area there. It was in the Tolka that they got slaughtered. Like, but it was a different bay back then. It was a much larger bay. Those Poolbeg, Piers, and all them, Dave. And North Bull Island is only a kind of a recent, in the last 200 years that has kind of created because of these additions, to Dublin Bay. But anyway, it was a huge tidal floodplain, and actually, Brian was probably quite aware of all of this as well because he would have camped out at Dublin many, many times, including the winter before for 3 months. So in the lead up to this, they actually camped out around the Dublin area to basically starve Sigtrygg out, like, to basically force his submission. And he refused, and they had to retreat for Christmas. And then came back in April 1014 to have this battle Easter weekend. So Brodir of Man survived the battle and was seemingly retreating. So Brian didn't fight the battle. He was in a tent and he was mourning the loss of his sons. Donnacha had survived. He was sent down to Leinster to thwart any extra additions from Leinster coming in to fight at the battle. And at this point, Donnacha probably wasn't back. So in his mind, all his sons were dead. And Brodir, through a cruel twist of fate, found Brian in his tent praying. And I look at it this way: Brodir of Man didn't owe any allegiance to anyone. He was probably here. He was here as a kind of a, one last Viking kind of attempt on fresh pasture, like, and in the end, when he found himself like looking around and seeing his people being slaughtered, he probably just bolted, like, and started bolting and got out and found Brian. And the account goes that he thought he was a priest in the beginning, and then he axed him down or whatever. Who really knows? But in the end, Brodir was captured by Brian's men, and he was disemboweled against a tree in Tomar's Wood, which existed at that time. Brian's body was brought to swords, and actually there was a reenactment recently. I have a video on my YouTube channel. There was a reenactment recently. I was invited to it.
Is it
Uh,
the wake of Brian Boru?
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I've seen it advertised. It's in that church on the hill there.
St. Columba's, yeah.
Yeah,
That's
St. Columba's
that's where he
Church.
was waked. So the
Yeah,
round tower that's there would have been there at that time. And he would have been, the wake would have started there, but then he would have been brought to Armagh where he's buried today. And they reckoned it was mourning for 12 days. It was really weird because what I find fascinating about the whole thing is that he, subjugated the whole island, but like he was still honored and brought up to Armagh and buried there, like, you know what I mean? Like, it's kind of interesting. And Máel Sechnaill took over as High King. And then to answer your question, then so he lasted for about 8 more years. He's like the steady hand. He took over. Sigtrygg and the Dalcassian clan just before I got into Sigtrygg was quite decimated. So Donnacha had to bring his men back to
yeah.
Munster. And Sigtrygg, why did Sigtrygg not do anything after this? I believe it's simple enough that what he attempted at that time was absolutely monumental because he didn't just fight. His uncle died. All of these commanders died. Everybody that he was involved with him died, you know? Every last warrior was killed, bar a dozen that escaped into the city. It was probably complete and utter trauma, and just like, what could he do? Like, he probably
Yeah.
already milked everything that he could have gotten, at that point. And he was getting a bit older now. He's probably in his 30s or 40s. So what he started concentrating on was diplomatic missions into Europe, and he became very much, he was a Christian, but he went to Rome, and he kind of focused on that kind of stuff. He laid the foundations for Christ Church. He didn't last. He was dead, I think, about 16 years later. Like, or was it
Are
60?
you
Yeah.
talking about Christchurch in Dublin?
Yeah, he laid the foundations for that. So
Wow,
he was dead around. Actually, sorry, Gormley was dead 16 years later. He was dead after that. Yeah, he laid the foundations for Christ Church.
that's really interesting.
Yeah,
And so to come back to something you mentioned earlier about Brian Boru's sons being in the battle, did I understand it correctly that one of his sons, his eldest son, also was killed in the battle? And
yeah.
if that hadn't happened, then there's a good chance that he could have taken over the High Kingship.
Oh,
And
100%. Murray.
yeah,
Yeah, he was lined up. That was the daughter. That was the son of the daughter of Connacht Moore. Yeah, I reckon he was had her very early on, so he was probably in his 50s. And he was a commander. And there's even this cool story about, and I listened to a podcast recently, or a video, maybe on Irish medieval history as well, that there's actually evidence of him having this unbelievable metal kind of gold plated helmet. He
yeah,
stood out, like he was meant to be an unbelievable warrior, and his grandson was fighting as well. I think it was Murray's son. Devastating. Both of them were killed,
yeah,
Yeah, but he was lined up, so he's heir apparent for the. So this was kind of going to be a new dawn. So like it was like he was going to be High King, like after Brian,
yeah,
right away after Brian. He was being lined up for it, like, and he was going to carry on the new power. Like he would have been the new emperor, you know?
yeah.
Yeah.
What are the primary sources for Brian Boru's life, and how reliable are they?
The primary sources are the annals of Ireland. So you have all the annals of Ireland, like the annals of Village Fallon, the annals of the Four Masters, the annals of Ulster, Armagh. Um, you were saying about, like, earlier on, like the annals, I think, of Ulster would have taken a bit of a back seat in his early rise, but actually, weirdly enough, for the Battle of Clontarf, they actually write quite a substantial piece
Yeah,
on the Battle of Clontarf. That just goes to show you his political sway in the north. If you remember who's writing the annals, it's the monks,
yeah.
it's the Christians, the Christian monks. So then you have the Chronicon Scotorum. You have the, obviously later on, the Cogad Gaelic Gaelaf. It's considered a primary source, even though it's
Mhm.
written afterwards. You have the Scandinavian sagas as well, and actually there's some lost sources. There was potentially Brian's saga of the Scandinavian world as well. How reliable are they? Look, I mean, at the end of the day, obviously political machinations were involved in the writing of these, but I think that's it for everyone. It's not just for Brian,
Yeah,
Um, you were taught. I think I was looking up about archaeological. I can't even speak now. I'm so tired.
archaeological.
Archaeological evidence for Brian's life, right? I'm getting tired now. I can feel my head getting heavy and all, but it's good though.
Yeah, we're bringing it into land, don't worry.
Yeah, we're landing in the bay now, like just like the
Yeah,
lads of old. The evidence for actual Brian's biological life. You know what I mean? It's kind of difficult. Now there is one um piece of evidence that actually directly relates to his life, which is the Leamore's sigil. Is it? Is it this Leamore? It's a kind of a piece of metal that was a part. It was in a monastery, and it actually talks about in honor of the son of Connecticut, King of Ireland, and it actually has that on it. It's in the Museum of Ireland. I think a part of the Brian Boru exhibition, and then there's other one. So in that time, the archaeological evidence is really it really kind of solidifies the world of Beru versus the actual characters that were in the world. But then when you tie it up with the actual annals and the primary sources, it kind of is a symbiotic nature of kind of proving, their existence, because it's hard to have actual specific pieces of physical evidence that relates to people of that time because of the subsequent conquest of Ireland, the destruction of the forts, the materials that were used, just the kind of bulldozing of these places as well later on in later years with no real thought, Clontarf, it's just a disaster because like I just don't think they really even gave a shit, really, to be honest, most of the time. And also the fact that the Battle of Clontarf, it was fought in such a kind of an area where it's like it's quite hard to know exactly where it was, and it probably was fought over a grand piece of land. Um,
Mm,
but when you get all the evidence that does exist of the Viking weaponry, the Gaelic weaponry, the Gaelic royal emblems and the tarab, the brooches, the mixture of the Viking and Gaelic pieces of evidence that the kind of the culture overlapping, when you kind of add it all together and you put all the what we do have as evidence together and line it up with the books, it kind of does give you a picture of
yeah.
Brian Boru's life. And actually in Killaloo, you do have references, or at least in part references to his time in Killaloo, because there is like doorways in churches and stuff like that were from the 10th and 11th century, wells that go right back to his time. There's a well that was Murrow's well, where his son that was killed at Battle of Clontarf, the one that was taking over, they reckon he was baptized at this well, and there's proof that it did exist at that time. So it is hard to have actual, complete, and utter proof, of this is exactly where he was at this specific time, but you have to marry up all the different types of evidence that you do have.
Okay. So I have two more questions.
Yeah. I hope that answers as well, by the way.
No, no, the answer was great because
Yeah.
yeah, you answered the next question I was going to ask as well about the archaeological evidence. Um,
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
yeah, so
Great.
that was a great answer. Um, so the next two questions are a little bit different, and it's more talking about his legacy. And I guess the first one I'd like to ask is what gaps in our knowledge remain about Brian Boru, and what are the biggest debates among historical scholars today about him and the Battle of Clontarf?
The gaps, I would, because when I was researching this, it's weird actually where the gaps actually do take place. There's obviously a big gap in his teenage years because remember he was just a prince. He wasn't really written into the records until later on, So there is a big gap, especially in around his teenage years when he went back to the fort, and you can have all this legendary tales about him, going off into the woods and taking on the Vikings himself with his own Fianna, and he was kind of mimicking Fionn McCool. So you have all this legend that is born out of that. So there is a kind of a gap there that's been filled by folklore essentially. But it's beautiful. Like it's nice to have those stories, and I don't necessarily completely throw them out, like because it does tie in with certain elements of the world that we're living in, because they would have been influenced by those stories at those times, and maybe perhaps he would have been doing these type of things. But that because there's such gaps, it's easy to fill them out with like tales.
Yeah, yeah.
you know and then there's a big gap. Actually, there's a kind of gaps when he takes over as High King, bar the campaigns in the kind of peace times, the peace times where he's refortificate, where he's doing all the refortifications and rebuilding and building blitz. There's actually not much happening because unless they're going to battles or raiding
Yeah,
or doing these type of things, there's not much happening. There's not much being written down.
yes.
Remember I was saying to you when he took over, when he had those battles and he took over the province of Munster, there is actually another gap there as well. But so then you kind of have to fill it in. um so those are the gaps in terms of his life. It's not, they're not too intense because we do have enough to build out a timeline. But they kind
And
of
and I suppose like we also can draw from the Irish medieval history of the time.
Yeah,
No, like you can make inferences for how Irish society operated at that time, and then you can kind of color in the gaps.
exactly.
Yeah,
And that's kind of what I was meaning about the and actually when I was talking, I won't mention specific names, when I was talking to a recent academic, he was talking about archaeologists and he didn't have really that good things to say at all. Like and the reason I'm saying that is because I wouldn't the archaeological evidence is suspect at the best of times with everything in Ireland because there's a lot of nonsense that have gone on down through the years and a lot of weird shit that's gone down and it's you do have to use everything at your disposal to color in the story and to actually come up with your timeline.
yeah.
You know,
I
so
mean,
it
I,
is.
I I do that as well when I'm talking about the Brehon Law. I also study mythology and I know a lot about the culture and society, and that allows me to make inferences into how did the law operate in practice because the Brehon laws, I'm not sure if I know you know what they are, but I'm not sure if you've looked at the manuscripts or anything like that. They're very aimed at the learned classes.
Mm,
So they're not telling you the jurisprudence of the law. They're just kind of telling you this is how this in this situation you should do this.
mm,
Um, they're very kind of technical. Let's just say
mm,
that.
mm.
They're not they weren't written for the layman. They were written for other lawyers.
Yeah, it's interesting and I'm definitely I need to do more research into the Brehon Law, by the way, definitely 100%. Um your last part of your question was about historians and was there
One of the
misconception?
biggest debates among scholars today.
It still exists, this ridiculous kind of oversimplification, baby out with the bathwater, black versus white kind of arguments about the Battle of Clontarf and you just even in the Irish History Museum, like a battle for Dublin, like what the hell are you talking about? Like, you know what I mean? Like if it's just this mere battle for Dublin, the Battle of Clontarf, for God's sake, there was hundreds of those battles that took place over our history. Like, I mean, it's just, and it's just such a. I think it's always coming from the people are always coming from their own political notions, right? And they're always
Mm.
coming from their own biases and their own ways of looking things. And we all can fall as victim to that. And I try my very best to not come at it from that angle. Maybe I am influenced as well without me really knowing, but I try to look at this from a broad perspective, like, and say, like, it cannot be just a battle for Dublin. Like, I mean, that's not what it was really about. It was to do with what he wanted to have in place, which is a united front, a united country. So, what the hell was he doing all those years beforehand? You know what I mean? What was that
Yeah.
for a battle for Dublin, or was that a battle for Ireland?
And,
This
and
was, you
yeah,
know.
that's a good segue into the next question, which
Hmm.
is how has Brian Boru's legacy been shaped by later generations, and why does he remain a national symbol?
Yeah. I think we maybe listened to the same podcast recently. It was a BBC. Sean Duffy was on that, I'm pretty sure,
Yes.
in our time. Yeah, yeah. So they were brilliant. They were brilliant because they actually talked about this stuff so eloquently. It was just so wonderful listening to that, to be honest. Um, so the Cogad Gael Gael of course, propaganda piece by the O'Briens, right after, So after Brian died, his
Could I
descendants,
just jump in there?
yeah,
You mentioned the O'Briens, but I don't think we mentioned this in the interview. Yeah, everybody who is an O'Brien is a descendant
yeah.
of Brian Boru.
Yeah. Well, pretty much. Like, I mean, give or take. But yeah, that they are. Like, it's. I mean, when I went to the My Ire, I was calling it the Mag Adder, but it's actually My Ire, I think it's called. The Dalcassian crowning point. I essentially put it out there. This is where O'Briens come from. Like, this is
Yeah.
The
Hmm.
Dalcash was the birthplace of the O'Briens. Essentially, obviously, it's a bit more complex, but it's essentially what it is. So what actually is actually happening at this time is you have Kinetic MacLorkin, Brian McKinetic, Donnacha MacBrian, Murkatak MacBrian, Targelback MacBrian. They don't want to drop the MacBrian, you know? They don't want to drop that, you see, because they want to be all going back to their grandfather and their great
Yeah,
grandfather.
yeah,
You
yeah.
start to see now a change. You start to see a change in the way they're looking at themselves. They weren't naming themselves after their own father. They were naming themselves after Brian, the Great, the
Can I
High
jump
King.
in there on that as
Yeah.
well? Because before the 10th century,
Mm,
it was common in Ireland to name yourself patrilineally.
mm,
So that's why you would be Cormac, the son of Art, the son of Con, the son of
mm,
this, the son of
mm,
that. And that's how you identify yourself. But it was apparently, now this could be, I don't know if it was Brian Boru exactly, but there's a belief that during his reign, he wanted to simplify that and said that families should take the name of a common ancestor. And
mm,
that's probably where this tradition it's likely this is where the tradition of the O's and the Macs actually comes from. The
mm.
10th century, there's no evidence that Brian Boru decreed this, but it happened around the time of his reign and he was the High King. So there's good reason to believe that it was Brian Boru himself that formalized this idea of having a clan name, a clan identity.
Yeah.
And that could be the profession you had, like the Macon Vards, which we now call wards, or the Brehony, which was Brehons, the the Macansair, which are Macateer, which is carpenters. So son of the craftsman, let's say. Um, and so or the area that you lived in, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I just wanted to add that little
No,
detail in
amazing.
because that could be why around that time they were saying MacBreen, MacBreen, MacBreen because they were identifying themselves as descending from a common ancestor, not their
Yeah.
patrilineal, not their grandfather to great great grandfather.
Yeah, 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 exactly. No, it makes total sense. And actually, weirdly enough, the Eimars and the Haraldsons and the Scandinavians were seeming to do this, Ragnarssons and things like that. They seem to be doing this. So maybe there was an influence from that, like because they were like say Ivar Eimar, like they were like kind of naming themselves after their ancestor Eimar or Ivar, whatever way you want to look at it. But anyway, we won't get into the weeds of that too much. But yeah, so it was after when Brian died, his descendants were claiming to be high kings, and like Donnacha had made a claim to be high king, and actually he was buried. So Donnacha survived the Battle of Clontarf. He was the guy that brought the Dalcassians home, the guy that was sent to Leinster, Gormlaith's son. He survived, and he was buried in Rome, actually, not in the Vatican, but in Rome. And actually, he's written in the missal there is a, I think it's called the missal, right? Or not the missal. What's the capstone there? He was written into as King of Ireland, and as well another piece of archaeological evidence of Brian's, kind of in part is actually Donnacha MacBrian's. Yeah, sorry, this is a Stowe missal. This is a book. It was a book that survived. I think, pretty much think it survived. I think it's in the museum, where Donnacha MacBrian's name as King of Ireland, I think, is in that as well. So he was claiming himself King of Ireland. Um, and then his grandson, I'm pretty sure his grandson had a claim on it, but definitely his great grandson, into Murkatak MacBrian, he was High King of Ireland. So this carried on. The O'Briens had formed, right? And so then later on, when all the shit started hitting the fan with the Normans, and they kind of, the way the political landscape was all over the place at this point, there was this huge, kind of a huge kind of desperate attempt to legitimize later O'Briens as, like, the direct descendants of Brian Boru. So this is where the Cogad Gael Nagalov comes from. And
Yes, okay, I got you.
yeah, yeah. So they were using this as a propaganda piece. But like, again, just because it was a propaganda piece doesn't mean it wasn't all true. It was. There was parts of it that were true, and parts of it tells the narrative. So yeah, I'm answering your question. I'm after forgetting. So yeah.
So it was like, how did Brian Boru's legacy, how did it shape later
Oh yeah.
generations,
So yeah,
and
the
why does he
congregate.
remain a national symbol?
Yeah. So the congregate Gaelov does elevate Brian as not just as a High King of Ireland, but like literally a martyr of Ireland.
Yes.
And a defeater of the heathens and the protector of Ireland. Like he was just, like elevated to a huge extent. In that podcast with Sean Duffy, I'm pretty sure he said that actually later on in the 13th century, when the Normans started conquesting in Ireland and had some big success in conquering Ireland, well, they did really because King Henry II became Lord of Ireland. There was a one guy in particular, and I believe Sean. I don't know who it was or what was said. I can't remember, but I believe him because his academic work is going on decades. Like there was a 13th century poet or scholar that actually had a poem about Brian being a national symbol at that time in the 13th century.
Yes.
So, this kind of lived on, but then it kind of something kind of, there's a big gap, as you probably know as well, between then, say, with the Normans came in, because they started like demolishing everything, and like even Baal Baruma was demolished, and a proposed castle was going to be built there. King Cora was gotten rid of, was burnt down by Gaelic chieftains. Everything started, a big huge gap started existing. But then later on in the 19th century, it started taking on a huge major part. Daniel O'Connell was a huge propagator of it as well because he was going to have one of the biggest ever protests, and we all talk. There's lots of protests going on at the moment, but like this was going to be a huge protest at Clontarf on the anniversary. Like, sorry, not the anniversary, the whatever you call it, the centennial.
Centenary. Yeah.
Yeah, um, around Daniel O'Connell's time. But actually, the Brits like got word of it, and I think they sent navy or something like that. They sent like a huge response to it to stop it. Like, and it was
Yeah.
going to be a peaceful protest. So this is where Brian's legacy was, it started getting huge, political movement around that time. It started to become a part of the nationalist movement because even you see, people forget, like people talk about the Easter Rising, but they were basing it off what Brian did as well. Like, they
Yeah.
weren't, you know what I mean? And actually, I think earlier rebellions were done on Easter weekend as well. I'm not too
Yeah,
sure.
actually, you forgot to mention that the Battle of Clontarf took place on, I think it was Easter.
I
It
briefly
was
mentioned
Easter
it, but
weekend.
yeah, I briefly mentioned that Easter week. Yeah, very, very kind of quickly mentioned it. It was Easter week. Yeah. So the Easter week has become this thing
Mm,
connected to then, right? And I guess it's like a part of our Catholic identity. It ties back to Brian becoming the martyr in the propaganda piece. The Easter, even our recent rebellions, they became martyrs as well, you know,
yeah.
in the cause for
I
national.
remember Padraig Pearse wrote something about like how our Lord gave his blood as a sacrifice for humanity, so Irish blood must be spilt to save Ireland.
Well, Tom Barry, who was a very interesting character, one of the greatest guerrilla warfmen that ever existed, in my opinion, who took on the British in Cork with 600, three or 600 men and got them out, like thousands of them out. But he does say that, like he does say that what happened on Easter weekend was a blood sacrifice. Like he's
Yeah.
no doubt about
I
it.
mean, it was written in not all of the writings, but it was written in like a lot of poems of Padraig Pearse, who he knew that he was going to die,
Yeah,
but he believed that through his death, Ireland would be reborn.
yeah,
And I feel like we're getting into a
yeah.
little bit too modern, and I'm afraid I'll say something that I'll regret. But
Yeah, but
it's
just to finish your question, Brian Boru's legacy and influence and political kind of, connotations and spiritual connotations, you know, rebellion kind of thing, like, kind of it ties into everything now in Ireland. And also as well, what you get a lot of is like everybody talks about Braveheart when they mention Brian Boru as a film project. Everybody talks about it. And why do they do that? Well, it's very clear why they do that, because the Scots took on the English, like, and the Scots, what William Wallace did was he defeated a hugely evil force, right? In that story. And so what people are getting mixed up in with the Brian Boru story, because they had such a simplistic version of it,
Yeah.
they're using the propagandized kind of version of it in their mind. You know what I mean? Because what
So when
Brian
you
did,
say propagandized, what do you mean?
well, that he was taking on it was good versus evil, and he
Okay.
was the
Yeah.
Christian martyr for Ireland.
Yeah.
You know?
But from what you've said tonight, it was a lot more complicated than that.
Absolutely. It's a lot more complicated than that, but I think the reason why I mentioned the Braveheart one is because everybody says it to me, because I'm a part of the film world, so everybody says it needs to be a Braveheart style film. But why, like, if you think about it, Braveheart is actually the story of Braveheart with what Brian was doing is completely different, really. Like, it's not
Yeah.
actually the same story,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
So they're influenced by that martyr-esque kind of, because William Wallace is martyred in the end, like, like for the Scots.
Mm-hmm.
So they're influenced by that, and they're also influenced by the fact that the heathen kind of pagan King Longshanks is killing William Wallace, and they kind of think in their mind it's the pagan influence of the Viking kings that were taking on Brian. That's not the case. That's
Mm.
not the case. So yeah,
Interesting.
yeah,
Feel like we could talk for another couple of hours, but
it is time.
it's time exactly. So I just want to say thank you so much for taking me
Off all
and
the
the
road.
audience on this journey. It's been a real really interesting listening to all you had to say, and I've learned so much just from this conversation as well. So how can people find you? You said you've written a book.
Hmm.
You have, I think you're on YouTube and TikTok and Twitter
Hmm.
and all of that sort of stuff. So
Yeah.
let's go through all of that now. You said you have a book. It's called The Forgotten Prince.
Yeah, well, first I just want to say Gurmila Malgut as well for bringing me on, and it was an absolute pleasure to talk to you. And I learned an awful lot from you before this and during the conversation. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And yeah, like if people want it very simplified, they could, and find anything that I've done, they can go to www.bertiebrosnanfilms.com and everything is there. But I do appreciate support on Instagram, Bertie Brosnan Films, Facebook, Bertie Brosnan Films, TikTok at Bertie Brosnan. If you just search Bertie Brosnan on any of them, you should come across on YouTube as well. YouTube would be great. And actually, if people want to follow up with this, there's a Brian Boru series at the moment that I'm kind of trying to promote. That's just it'll be an episode kind of documentary series like that I'm doing
Hmm.
myself.
Yeah. And where can we
Also,
find that?
that's on YouTube. So that's on
That's on
YouTube.
YouTube.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then my book, The Forgotten Prince, is as I mentioned earlier on, it's based on the Battle of Clontarf, the days leading in, the day of, and the days afterwards, and it's through the eyes of the protagonist, Donnacha MacBrien, but actually has scenes with Brian and Boru in his tent and Brodir of Man, and shows the whole landscape of that. That was adapted from a screenplay, King Brian and Broder, which nearly went into production with Timothy V. Murphy playing Brian Boru. So if people want to buy that, and if people want to get a signed copy, get in touch with me by email. That can be arranged as well. So yeah, that's kind of what I have to advertise. I really appreciate
Excellent.
it.
Yeah, there was a few things you said during this call that I was just imagining uh how it could be made into a film. And you've mentioned a couple of times that you're involved with the film world. So can we expect to see any productions of Brian Boru on the big screen or the little screen in the near future?
Well, I was involved with the film world very seriously for many years. Now I'm not, but I still have connections and I still have talking to people, and I did have money in place for that short film, and it was going into production. I had a whole team in place and everything. let's just say this. If I get the money, I'm making it. Now I'll start with a short and then, build out into bigger projects. My life goal and my life dream is to make it. But in the meantime, in the interim, what I'm doing is writing books on the topic. So I have a sequel. I actually have a trilogy actually that follows Donnacha's life right up until he is buried in Rome, and then I'm going to go back and write the trilogy of Brian Boru's life, which is I have a pilot script already written for that, and that's where it all started. So I want to create my intellectual property, and I hope that that does actually influence investors because they're not just getting like a pitch, or they're not just getting like a screenplay. They're getting a whole selection of books. Now Morgan Llewellyn has already written a lot of books on this topic, but the problem with Morgan Llewellyn, there's no problem with Morgan Llewellyn and her work. It's amazing. It's an incredible work. I own a couple of her books. Incredible work. The problem
I
is
think
that
I have a book by her, it's the Brian Saga or something like that.
she's got a number of them. Emperor of the Irish, Pride of Lions. She's got a very good one is Brian Boru 1014, The Battle of Clontarf. It's a wonderful book because it marries academic work with historical fiction. It's a
Hmm.
hugely brilliant book. Um, but the problem is that many, 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 many people have optioned her books and it's never come to fruition. And I think it's time for a fresh kind of.
What do you mean by optioned?
Sorry, what I mean by optioned is that production companies have bought the rights to her books for
Okay.
a length of time to go into production. This has been happening since the 90s,
Hmm.
and it's just never happened. And do you know what I do truly believe? I truly believe this, and I have no problem saying it, and I've made videos about this. I genuinely believe that the Irish film industry, the Irish government, do not want to make these films. I'm
I I
100% convinced.
I was gonna ask you like, do you think there's something going on there? But
Yeah, 100%. There's one,
yeah,
and I tell you one last thing, and the reason why I think it's 100% true. I've gotten flack off Irish people for pointing this thing out. An actual fact. Viking series produced in Ireland from 2010 right up until modern day,
yeah,
almost 15 years of production. Part financed by the Irish taxpayer through tax rebates. People don't understand how tax rebates work. Actually, the Irish taxpayer does, it facilitates that money going into the production. Now, the money does come back through economy, but there is a cultural test. There is all these factors involved where you have to prove it being good for Irish culture and stuff like that. Can anybody name an episode where any of those series take place in Dublin? Any of those series take place in Ireland? Yet, if you go and look at the series, and actually, Irish
yeah.
producers have worked in this, Irish actors, Irish locations,
My
everything
brother
Irish.
was in it.
Yeah, yeah. Not one. They
Mm,
they mention it at one point fleeting, and they put in these silly romantic fantasy characters in the latest one, these girl warriors or something, which is
yeah.
just fantasy stuff like, which there is girl warriors. I'm not saying there wasn't, but it's just like why isn't there an actual story about the historical events with Ivor the
Mm,
Boneless?
mm.
You
Yeah,
know,
because that's the thing. Like Ivor the Boneless, who is a pretty significant character in that series, I believe he had time in Ireland.
yeah, he was potentially, a lot of academics agree he was King of Dublin, or at least co-King of Dublin. See, Dublin and York were connected cities.
Mm,
And I was just absolutely and utterly devastated when they sent Ivor the Bonus, which never happened, to Roos, and they didn't bring him to Dublin, where he was
yeah,
actually launching his Britain campaigns. He was
yeah,
launching them from Dublin. So
yeah.
that's proof. And I one last thing, I actually had a coffee one time with a guy, and I won't say much about who he is or but he let's just say he was highly, let's just say there's a connection with someone that was a part of the high end a part of that. And when I pointed this out to him, he was literally in a state of shock, and he was actually taken back because he never thought about this, and he was like, I'm going to have to ask them about this. And the meeting kind of ended fairly abruptly after that. And I never heard from him again. Swear
Mm.
to God. I genuinely do believe that there is a block and a stoppage to anything to do with that time in Ireland. Yeah.
Bertie, it's been an absolute pleasure. I don't want to ask another question because I
No,
feel like we could just go down another rabbit hole. But this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for taking me on this journey. And I'm sure my audience will be very grateful as well if they've gotten to the end, which I think this is going to be about a 3 hour, 3 hour cut.
at
Um,
least we put the most controversial stuff at the tail end and not the beginning.
exactly, exactly. Okay,
Thank
thanks
you so
so
much,
much for
brother.
your time, Bertie.
Thank
All the
you.
best.
All the best. Thank you.
Bye. Well, there you have it, folks. I told you it was going to be a marathon. 3 hours we spoke, and I think I wasn't the only one that was pretty tired by the end of it because I could tell that Bertie Brosnan was also getting a bit tired. But I really learned a lot from this conversation. I thought that I knew all there was to know about Brian Boru, and it appears that my knowledge was kind of elementary. And I'd just like to thank Bertie Brosnan for his time and his generosity in sharing his research with all of you and with me. Before I go, please just a reminder to check out the brehonacademy.org. That's where you're going to get access to all three of my online courses. That's Early Irish Culture and Society, Irish Mythology, and the Brehon Laws of Early Ireland. If that doesn't float your boat, then there's lots of articles there that you can read for free. And we also have a merchandise store where you're going to be able to buy t-shirts, mugs, posters, all of that good stuff. And if you want to support me on a monthly basis, then please consider becoming a member. We have 6 membership levels, and you can get in for as little as 1.99 per month. So that's like €25 per year. And also check us out on Facebook, on X, on Instagram, and on YouTube. I'm starting to dabble with TikTok, so you can expect to see us on TikTok in the future. And with all of that being said, a very tired Kevin Flanagan here, signing off and saying until next time, my friends, slán go fóill.